Man, I want to start by thanking you first because I've said this before. I think I've told you this too. I don't think if it were for you and Tom, and I think many people across the world can say this at this point, I would have ever found the no virus terrain based position. And it came at a time in my life when I had my own direct experience with moving out of a toxic environment, moving my family out of a toxic environment in which my wife's so-called autoimmune symptoms had just returned. And upon moving, they all went away. So that was at the very beginning of 2020. I had fallen for the idea that, COVID was made in the lab. And I was actually telling a lot of my family members in January and February, you need to go get masks and stuff. I knew what it was for. I knew it was going to be for mandatory vaccines and things like this, but I believe they had successfully created a bioweapon in the lab. And then came across a video from Tom talking about following dolphins off the coast of Florida or something like this. I'm sure you remember the video I'm talking about very early on. And then also your interview on, I think it was initially David Icke's platform, but I don't think he interviewed you. I think he just showed a clip of you maybe. But then your interview, I think on London Real, or maybe it was David Icke on London Real. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was April of 2020 that I came across you, and it just made so much sense. So then I went down the never-ending rabbit hole, and here I am, and I'm so stoked to be having this conversation with you, man.
Well, Alec, I couldn't be happier that you joined the bandwagon because, you've been kind of a force of nature, really, with your enthusiasm, your youthful curiosity, and then, I watched you master the material, right, and sort of really make a transformation in terms of your understanding of science, logic, philosophy, and I'm glad that you are an advocate for the truth.
Thanks, man. It means a lot. Thank you. Let's start with your background. And I want to start with framing this conversation towards more exploration into psychotropic medications at first, because I know you have a background as a psychiatrist. So let's start there first.
Yeah, well, I used to be a psychiatrist. That's true. And I specialized in forensic psychiatry, which means that I did a lot of work inside of like correctional facilities or working with juvenile delinquents. But also I did expert witness work and taught things about the law and was involved in research. But I think the forensic aspect actually really helped me out because it's where you're asked a difficult question to give an opinion on it, right? And the opinion is supposed to be based as much as possible on science, logic, and facts. And you generally have a mountain of data to look through. Like, for example, in some cases where, let's say, I might evaluate someone accused of a crime for the insanity defense, I'd be handed usually a couple of boxes of records. I mean, it would go back to, their school records, all kinds of like statements from family members and contacts, all of their health and psychiatric records and, correctional records, criminal history, everything you can imagine. And then in addition to that, spend up to 7 or 8 hours interviewing the person. And you develop some skills in distilling down the facts. A lot of the information you have to go through is irrelevant or misleading, and so you have to sift through that, prioritize it, use skills like discernment. And whatever your opinion is, you have to defend it in a courtroom, which is very difficult. Lawyers are extremely challenging. They can be very tricky. So you can't just willy-nilly speak your mind or have an agenda. You really have to, unless you want to be embarrassed or not successful, you have to be extremely rigorous, and you get more efficient in recognizing patterns and, distilling out what is real and what's not. So that's kind of a little bit about the background that led me, into this realm. But I, of course, applied it to my psychiatric practice itself. And I had a number of key moments, along the path to realize that psychiatric medicines are, not a good thing. In fact, they're quite harmful. And I've seen lots of evidence of that harm, both in my personal experience and in the medical literature.
Did it start with personal experience first?
I think in part because it was very early in my residency training when I first specialized in psychiatry that I got exposed to this from the point of view of, the established medical system. There was a black box warning that was issued by the FDA on SSRI antidepressants. And that happened early on in my residency training when I didn't even have that much experience prescribing or observing people taking these medications yet. But this black box warning stated that in children and adolescents, that these drugs can increase suicidal behaviors, which was kind of a strange term because it being fairly vague. But one could look in the research literature and see that suicide behaviors are actually highly correlated with completed suicide. So this was definitely a serious warning. And these warnings don't even come up by the FDA unless, they're basically saying only use this drug in a life-threatening emergency, really. And I don't think you can antidepressants necessarily fit that bill. I mean, you can have a suicidal emergency with people who are severely depressed. That happens commonly, but there's no evidence that these drugs decrease the suicide risk. Mm-hmm. So with now new information that they could increase the suicide risk, and there was a very telling reaction by the faculty at the residency because they, gave us this special announcement, and then they told us, basically, we all know that really it's depression that causes people to have suicidal behaviors, not the drugs. But what we're going to do is we're going to have a policy that anytime you start a new patient on one of these drugs, you're going to call them in a few days to check up on them.
Wow.
And that was basically part of the training that I would call, and was commonly called CYA, cover your ass.
And that was a perfect example of begging the question there too. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. So how did it evolve from there, from you understanding the harms of specifically SSRIs to also understanding the harms of benzos? And I know that you, correct me if I'm wrong on this, weren't necessarily prescribing these in any case throughout your psychiatric practice because you're a forensic psychiatrist.
Well, let me correct you, because during my 4-year residency of doing general psychiatry, I was required to prescribe these medications. And
let me stop you there. Required. What do you mean by required? Because that's interesting.
Well, I mean, my job was to take care of patients, and the way they taught us to take care of patients was to prescribe medicines. And if I didn't, I had to justify it to a supervisor.
Wow. Okay, that's really interesting to hear. So, kind of gives you a window into how much medical doctors do have the ability to deviate from what is the common dogma, essentially.
Right. Well, but, don't forget, this is in a supervised training setting. There's basically an apprenticeship type model in medicine. It's institutionalized, so it's not an individual, apprentice and mentor relationship. There's a group of mentors.
Unique to residency to some degree then.
Yeah, each residency has their own, faculty that supervise, and, you have to have your records and your plan approved. And co-signed often. So you have to do what's expected. But even, there's other constraints. Like, for example, a patient comes to you, they're already prescribed these medicines, and you can't just willy-nilly stop them because that can be dangerous. And so you're forced to continue prescribing them. Or in the correctional setting, which is part of forensic psychiatry, then the same standards apply, although they prefer certain types of drugs because some of these drugs actually have like a black market value that people use them to get high.
Mm-hmm. Like very similar to street drugs in some ways.
Well, no, they are street drugs. I mean, like, that you can get prescription opioids as street drugs, right? So it's the same thing with many psychiatric drugs.
Right.
And there might even be some drugs that wouldn't necessarily have a street value on the streets, but in the correctional setting, where it's hard to get things, right? So like some of the older antidepressants that are very strongly antihistamine, type of drugs, they can be very sedating.
Mm.
So they may not be desirable on the street where you have access to anything, but in a correctional setting, they can have value. Even, like I'm talking about tricyclic antidepressants, for example.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's any value in benzos or SSRIs?
Well, SSRIs, I would say no, and I can go into a lot more about why that is, and it's mostly because of the harm and the lack of any demonstrated benefit. Mm-hmm. With benzodiazepines, there are a couple of discrete examples where they could potentially be life-saving, but this would be, for either one dose or very, very short-term use. And I'm talking about two situations. One is where someone's having a seizure where it won't stop. Mm. Many times, the use of a benzodiazepine can arrest a seizure. People might be familiar with Diastat, which is a thing that parents of children with epilepsy might keep at home, and it's a Valium suppository essentially that they can use if a seizure won't stop quickly. The other situation is drug withdrawal, but specifically withdrawal from either benzodiazepines themselves, which
right.
Obviously if they weren't available, that wouldn't happen, but also from alcohol. Now, you can actually use alcohol to taper down and prevent alcohol withdrawal, but this is no longer considered acceptable in a medical setting. So there were times when, lives have been saved under my care or care of my colleagues because alcohol withdrawal can definitely be life-threatening, and I've seen that several times in the jail setting. Mm-hmm. And in the hospital setting. And I even testified as an expert witness in one case of this. It was actually a benzo withdrawal case where a guy got arrested, and it was really for a very low charge, but they simply refused to prescribe him Xanax in jail, but even though he had been taking it for 20 years.
Wow. So basically cutting him cold turkey.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
I've seen that. Can I pause you there real quick?
Yes, please.
Just to give people into like personal insight into what that looks like. My mom cut cold turkey off of a benzo. I don't remember exactly which one. I think it actually was Xanax. I'm not 100% sure. And I witnessed over the course of nearly a year where the majority of the time she was hallucinating, walking through our house late at night, claiming to see apparitions, not sleeping for weeks at a time, sitting in her bathroom, obsessively picking her face with her eyes really wide and pupils very dilated, just staring at herself almost as if she was possessed. Hallucinating to the degree that she thought I was her dad and she was her 13-year-old self again, shaking, akathisia, not eating for weeks on end, not sleeping for multiple nights in a row. It was incredibly dark to witness. And I'm sure you have countless stories seeing this yourself as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was, talking about it more in the acute setting, and I want to just emphasize that it's not just scary or uncomfortable, but this is a life-threatening situation. Mm. I've seen times when people have had, basically, they become delirious, which means they lose their mental faculties, so it can involve hallucinations, but they become disoriented. They may not know where they are, what's going on. And also they have autonomic instability where their basically heart rate becomes dysregulated, and they can get arrhythmias that can be fatal. Mm-hmm. And I've, had patients in the ICU or the cardiac ICU because of withdrawal. Wow. So this is a serious thing. In this case that I was involved in, the guy had a seizure, and the seizure caused him to dislocate and injure his shoulder, and he required shoulder surgery.
Wow.
After that. And, it could have easily, of course, been avoided. But, so in that case, if he hadn't been prescribed Xanax in the first place, of course, that situation wouldn't have occurred. But I still think, there is an occasional role for these drugs, but there may be other ways of dealing with those situations that I just don't know about because I haven't, had the experience yet. I certainly did learn initially from Kelly Brogan's work, and then from working with clients myself as a consultant, that there are things you can do that can really mitigate any withdrawal when you're coming off these drugs.
Mhm.
And I'm talking about things like doing an elimination diet or certain nutritional things, doing cleansing, like coffee enemas, for example. And you can prepare yourself and have a much, much easier time getting off these drugs.
Yeah, that's exactly what my mom did. Followed Kelly's protocols, if you want to call it that, after she had cut cold turkey, had multiple suicide attempts and all these things. In order to begin to heal, you could say it was following all of what Kelly recommended. And that's kind of what sent me down this path in the first place, is that. And then Kylie reversing her so-called autoimmune conditions and things like this. So
let me just add one
ahead.
more thing, because I just want emphasize, the danger of these drugs, because we can look at large studies. For example, there's one out of Pennsylvania, which is, I believe there's another similar study with similar outcomes in England, looking at sleeping medications, looking at really it's any sedating drug used for sleep in a large patient population. And there was a significantly increased mortality in 5 years from taking as little as, I believe, something like 11 doses of sleeping medication in an entire calendar year.
Wow.
If we look at antipsychotics, okay, which are some of the most prescribed drugs, things like Seroquel, Zyprexa, Risperdal, there was a study looking at all the Medicaid recipients taking these drugs who were teenagers. I believe it was in the state of Tennessee, and it was a pretty large number of kids. And a substantial number of them had sudden death from these drugs. And I've seen at least one case like that from my own experience of sudden death from an antipsychotic. And then we have antidepressants, and we can also look at several studies. There's a large Canadian study. There's also the Women's Health Initiative study, I think it's called, which shows from people just taking SSRIs that they have increased mortality of all cause in 5 years. And in the Women's Health study, they had increased incidence of strokes, and that's one of the mechanisms for the increased mortality. So just taking these drugs has serious health consequences. It's difficult to get off these drugs, and there's really no proof of any substantial benefit from these drugs, except for the very limited circumstances I told you about.
Right. A lot of people will claim benefit from these drugs, and I think from my perspective, and I don't claim to know with certainty, the benefit that they claim is that it's really just cutting them off from feeling in many ways. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that is a common experience people have on many of these types of drugs, but I'm not, I mean, I'm sure that that's not a benefit, because our feelings are very important.
Right.
They provide us, information about what's going on. They help us make decisions about who to have relationships with and all kinds of important things that we wouldn't function very well. And also saying that, how is that different from using alcohol or cannabis or heroin to escape your feelings? So are we drug pushers, or are we trying to help people heal and restore themselves?
Right. And then going back to your example in residency, they already presume these things to be helpful and then say that, oh, these people are just depressed, which is causing all of these issues. See what I'm saying? They already presume them to be helpful to people. And I think that's the sort of entrenched mindset amongst much of psychiatry today. I think it's sort of evolving now, though.
Well, among doctors, right, what tool do we have, right? I mean, the reputation of, the all-powerful and successful modern medicine, it's largely in the hands of the pharmaceutical. And that's what doctors believe in. So if you try to tell medical students that a drug is not beneficial, that's going to raise some eyebrows, because the whole, predicate of going to medical school is that you're going to mostly learn about drugs and how awesome they are and how to prescribe them.
When you were in medical school, did you already have a proclivity to be critically thinking, or is that something that evolved over time? Like, were you skeptical of some of the information you were being taught?
Well, it's difficult to be skeptical when everything is new to you and there's an overwhelming amount of information that you have to take in.
Right.
So mostly during medical school, or at least the first 2 years, which is the book learning part, there's just not really time to question things very much. Everything is focused on becoming familiar with the information, because at the end of the 2 years, you have to take step 1 of your boards, and it's a 2 full day exam. And it basically, you have to know a huge swath of information in order to pass that. And even though the people who generally go to medical school, they've never failed anything in their life, they do the scoring on this exam to make sure a certain number of people fail.
Wow.
So you're going to have that stress, that you do not want to be one of those people. You want to get out of medical school and practice medicine. You don't want to, because for those people who do fail, each time they retake it, the chance of them passing goes down. So it's kind of a
is that
not
built
a good
in?
whole.
Is that built in, that each time they take it because they had already failed, or is it just that's what the data shows?
That's what the data shows. I mean, it'd be hard to build in what would happen in the future into the test.
I meant like,
but,
because they failed previously, then the people who are doing the grading say, okay, this one we're going to already knock down a few points.
The same scoring system is applied each administration. And this is just like grading on a curve. All these standardized tests are done this way rather than being competency based. And I think this is also a problem in medicine, but it's sort of a separate, smaller issue. But there should be, a test. If you're going to test people, there should be that they have to have the minimum amount of knowledge, skill, expertise to do the job. And that means that if everyone who graduated medical school possessed that, they could be 100% pass rate. And that would be great. That would be a testament to the quality of the education. But they don't set it up that way because of a number of factors, and probably because testing is an industry. And they, in order to make money, if they make more money if you have to take the test more than one time.
What happens in your experience to people who are outspoken and critical of what they're being taught while at medical school?
I did not witness that at all.
That's crazy.
During medical school.
That's crazy to hear, though, especially given how you've totally flipped upside down everything you've been taught, essentially.
I mean, there was one minor exception, but this was more about a policy rather than medicine that I was involved with. And it was trying to reform resident work hours, because there were no guidelines or regulations, so they could, work residents 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there were some residents who actually did that, at least for a period of time. As a medical student, there was one call that I had on surgery where I worked 39 straight hours, with almost a full week of work in one shift.
Wow.
And a lot of that was just about hazing.
Yeah.
I waited for 6 hours for the chief resident to come and round with us. And while I was waiting, after being up all night, he went to work out, had a leisurely lunch. And then when he was good and ready, finally came to spend 20 minutes with us so that we could go home and sleep.
My goodness. I liken it to my time at West Point in the Army. I would say primarily at West Point, though, where you're amongst a group of people. It's a very rigorous, tough environment, which sort of builds what you could call trauma bonds with these people. There are good friendships, don't get me wrong, but when you're going through a tough experience together, you look to your left and your right, no one's questioning anything, or no one seems to be questioning anything. Maybe they are in their minds, but they're just sort of accepting what they're taught, especially because everyone else around them is doing it. So you just assume that what you're being taught is true. And then add on to that, with West Point, we're taught that the Army does the right thing. We're taught all these values about morality. We had this acronym called leadership that we were taught. We have all these things that are instilled in us in the cadet prayer: cadet will not lie, cheat, or steal. A lot of sentiments surrounding morality that are then wrapped into some of the things that we're being taught, trained to kill people, like trained that it's necessary, things like this. It sort of fractures your mind in a way, or you just immediately assume that, okay, well, because we're being taught these things and also being taught these things, it must mean that we're adhering to these, values that we're being taught. I wonder if it's the same when it comes to medical school, when you're taught the Hippocratic Oath, for example. So you're assuming that all of these other things about pharmaceuticals, about, the foundations for what causes illness are just automatically true because you're looking to your left and your right, and everyone else is buying into it. But then also because you sort of have that, whether you want to call it subconscious or just implied reality of, okay, well, we're being taught this Hippocratic Oath, and they're also teaching us these toxic things. It must mean that these things are in line with the Hippocratic Oath.
Well, I think this is interesting analogy. And in my medical school, they did not teach the Hippocratic Oath. Now, I think collectively, as medical students, we were at least aware of it, but there was no academic teaching about it. And the first time...
It was implied, though, right? Like,
well,
the sentiments.
I'm going to tell you.
Okay.
So the first time we really heard about it officially from the school was at commencement when we recited it. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that that's at the end after we've already learned medicine. Mm-hmm. Throughout the experience of learning medicine on the practical level, because medical school, the first 2 years you spend in the classroom, and then the second 2 years you spend on the wards in the hospitals and clinics. So you're actually, doing and learning the medicine. You're watching other doctors, and what they do, and you're playing a role. And what I observed was not consistent with the Hippocratic Oath. So what I learned on the ground of this is what I'm supposed to do, it conflicted with that oath. And later on, there were a few conversations here or there among the doctors, or trainees, and it was kind of joking around. It's like, first do no harm, but then after that, you have to do harm. It's
Holy
like, well,
shit.
or first do no harm, then what do you do second?
Do harm. Holy shit, man.
Because if you read the consent form for chemotherapy, for example, on there it says that you may develop cancer from the chemotherapy.
Insane.
And, this is what happened to my grandmother.
Wow. The other question that I want to ask related to medical school, so I kind of want to set the stage for where we're going next in the rest of this conversation, is how much of your time at medical school is spent learning to analyze and scrutinize scientific papers?
I don't recall any time devoted towards that. I did have a dedicated seminar in residency in that, which was kind of pivotal for me. But in medical school, I really don't recall. Perhaps there was a course on epidemiology, and they may have covered some material there about the different kinds of studies, like a cohort study, a case study, right. A randomized control trial. But I can't remember if that was in residency or medical school or both. But there was no, journal clubs where we criticized papers or anything like that in medical school.
Okay. I've never asked that question before, and I think that's really important context because it's assumed amongst virtually all of society that medical doctors and other, you could say, health experts, nurses, nurse practitioners, DOs, et cetera, have an ability to scrutinize scientific papers and
Well,
are
I can tell you something funny about this,
yeah,
Alec,
please.
because contrary to probably popular opinion, doctors in general, like most people in general, are afraid of math. So when they put this required epidemiology class on us, it happened during my year. My class in medical school was the first one to have this mandatory course, and you had to calculate some numbers like sensitivity and specificity, positive predictive value, negative predictive value, these kinds of parameters. And, by the way, this came up, of course, related to the PCR test and other allegedly diagnostic tests during COVID, right? That,
Mhm.
sort of understand what is a false positive and false negative result. Like the people who were talking about that at the time clearly didn't even know what those things were.
Right.
And the same thing happened in my med school class that a bunch of people failed the class and there was a cheating scandal that people were so afraid they would fail that they cheated. And then, there was all of this controversy around it. Fortunately, I wasn't, involved in that at all. I already knew how to do those calculations, so it was just like a review for me, fortunately. But that's something I learned in a different context before I went to medical school. And then also, I know teaching residents and fellows and I supervised research projects when I was on the faculty of a medical school, and also then I knew that they not only they were also afraid of math, and that's really important in medical research because every clinical trial has a statistical analysis. And if you don't understand, because they're using statistical models and statistical tests, and if you don't understand what those are and how they're devised, you're not going to be able to understand and interpret the results correctly of the study.
Like, how many doctors know what a p-value is?
Well, they probably at least can give lip service that they say a p-value, but do they really know? Can they define what it is?
Gotcha.
And do they also know how it's calculated? Because a p-value is only calculated based on a specific statistical model or test. And that's critical because if they apply the wrong model that doesn't resemble the actual data correctly, then your p-value is irrelevant because whatever the outcome is not going to be accurate. And there are many, many tricks and deceptions that can be done here. Like one very common one, and they actually taught us about this at Duke, where they did teach us this skill, and they called it the critical appraisal approach. And we had to do it every week, and we were assigned papers to do this, and it was very good. It's just that it never got integrated into anyone's practice. It was just an intellectual exercise.
Got it.
But the relative risk versus absolute risk. And this is critical because if you have something that is relatively rare in a population, so let's say it's 0.001% of the population has this thing, and it goes from 0.0001 to 0.0002, the relative risk is 100% increase.
Right.
And it sounds scary, but the absolute risk increase is 0.0001.
Right.
And which is meaningless, right? It's probably just by chance or error. And this is a trick that's used to make the effect of therapeutics like drugs look much better than they actually are.
This came up during the COVID era with, I think it was actually all the shots. I want to say in each of the clinical trials.
Yes, it did.
Relative risk reduction versus absolute risk reduction. I think it was Tom Cowan, I want to say, who has this, who shares this experience in medical school. I guess he was taught this. I don't know the context. I don't know what class it was in. I don't know anything like that. But he asked the professor why it is they only share one of those versus the other. They don't give the full context in sharing information regarding these studies, whether it's in the abstract or otherwise. And the professor said, because no one would take the drugs. That was his answer.
Yeah, that's same thing with like number needed to treat versus number needed to harm.
Right.
But if you understand what these things are, you could actually usually from the published paper, you can calculate it yourself.
Mm.
And I've done this many times, or I do a chi-square test on data, because you can pull up a calculator on the web now where you can plug in some numbers and you can get these values if you know what numbers you need to put in. And it's a very useful skill, but almost no one, understands this. And also, doctors, the way that their practice is set up in their professional life, they don't have time to sit there and do this. And they don't do it in any, maybe in academic settings, they have journal clubs and meetings, but, that is only a small number of doctors. Most doctors in private practice world, the only education they get about clinical studies is directly from drug reps.
That's just crazy to hear that, I mean, I've heard it before, and even hearing it again, though, is just so nuts to me. Because of
Alec,
what is
even, that there's continuing education requirements for doctors, like for your license and such. Basically, what happens is the pharmaceutical industry gets together, they create a shell company that's a medical education company. That company then contracts with the certifying body, like the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, for example, who governs psychiatrists and their board certification. They make a contract with that company and they say that their material is required to meet your continuing education requirements. So you make sure you get force-fed that propaganda. It's really marketing. It's
insane.
Marketing.
Well, and then what happens too, especially because most doctors, I would argue the overwhelming majority don't know how to read and interpret scientific papers and scrutinize them, is they're fed these journals that sit on the desk in their office and they read the abstract or they read the conclusion, and then they just assume that what happened to come to that conclusion is true.
Yeah. And many of the organizations, like I want to say Medscape, or I still get some of these emails, they basically take the title of these papers and they put it into like a soundbite blurb, right? And that's really what most doctors, that's all they look at. But even if you had the time, and even if you understood enough math to interpret the statistical analysis, you still can't understand the implications of any results of any study without reading the methods section and how the experiment was conducted. And in the scientific literature, not just in medical science publications, by the way, there has been a sudden change that no one has talked about, but where they don't actually describe the methods in the paper. They put it now in the supplemental materials, which would be, where there were like extra data tables that were not discussed in the study, like in the past, or there might be like a list of the specific equipment that they use, like detail that you wouldn't want to take up the pages. But now the entire method section is in that, and it's in a different, page in the journal. So a different file on the website that's not just there linked, obviously. So you have to play detective and hunt down just to even read how they actually did the experiment. So it's almost as if the entire industry is trying to prevent you from really understanding what's going on. And, there are many, many more problems with scientific accountability, and I know you've talked about this with other guests at length before, but, like the difference between science and engineering, where in engineering, that the knowledge is accurate because you have to be able to build a device that works.
Mm-hmm.
And in science, you rely on someone else to repeat your experiment and get the same results. But that almost never happens.
Mm-hmm.
Like almost never does anyone even try to repeat it. And then many times when they do, they can't get the same results.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like they need to publish so many papers that you could get almost anything published, and it could be, completely false.
It's so interesting on that too, because a lot of people will fallaciously point to, well, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of papers on this, therefore it must be true. Or there's a whole paradigm of medicine or health or schooling around this, therefore it must be true. And to play on what you just said about the supplementary method section, in one of the original, quote, SARS-CoV-2 isolation papers, the one that came out of Australia, and I have it here in front of me, isolation rapid sharing of the 2019 novel coronavirus SARS-CoV-2 from the first patient diagnosed with COVID-19 in Australia, that method section was a supplementary method section that you had to go dig for. And unless you knew that already, you wouldn't. And you would just assume, oh, okay, yeah, clearly here they've isolated the virus. So that was actually a perfect segue into what I wanted to talk to you about next. How did you initially wake up to the reality that SARS-CoV-2, we're going to start there, that SARS-CoV-2 had not been demonstrated to exist or cause disease?
Good question. In February of 2020, I went out to California to visit my friend and go to racing school at Laguna Seca. And on my way back at the San Jose airport, I saw all these people wearing surgical masks. And they weren't, just people going to Asia. They were Americans. And I was just shocked by this and perplexed that I felt like I had to figure out what was going on. And I had in my possession at that time, which I was planning to read on the flight, was Nancy Turner Banks' book, AIDS, Opium, Diamonds, and Empire. And
that's a pretty crazy coincidence right there.
Well, I, purposely was studying that book. But I'll tell you what the real coincidence is. The real coincidence is that I first put out, ever a podcast on social media criticizing medicine in November of 2019. So just a few, right before COVID. And also the first time I really heard germ theory be questioned was on Alpha Vedic podcast, where they brought up the book about Béchamp and Pasteur.
Wow. Shout out to Alpha Vedic for that one.
So that led me, and then also I found out about the, Nobel laureate, the inventor of the PCR, I'm blanking on his name right now. Kary Mullis, yeah. Who I was actually looking at his lecture on climate change, and found that he had this other thing about like being unable to find the paper proving the existence of HIV. And he even asked, Luc Montagnier, and Luc Montagnier didn't give him the paper, right? Because there is no paper. Mm-hmm. So that led me to find out about Nancy Turner Banks' book, and I was kind of exploring these issues. But because of the masks, and I knew that there was something going on, in China, and I decided when I got home let me just look at the papers. The first time I looked at a scientific paper that purported to discover a virus, and I had no idea about the methods that they were going to use to do that. But I found a paper. It wasn't the Australian paper. I think it was about a case in China.
Was it Fan Wu?
Well, that's the genome paper.
That's the genome paper. Right.
So, but
Zhao?
it was in,
Zhao,
I think it was Zhao, yes. Yeah. SARS-CoV-2 isolation paper. Mm-hmm. And I read that paper. I read the methods section, and I read the whole thing because, in there, they actually didn't claim they discovered a new virus. They said they may have discovered it, okay? And it may be responsible they did say they discovered it. They didn't say it was responsible for the illness. They say it could be. And I was just kind of perplexed because I'm like, did I just read this paper where they did all this stuff, but none of it actually demonstrated discovering a new virus? And so I read it again, and I read it a couple more times, and I'm like, what the heck's going on here? And then I'm staring at the picture because they had, electron microscope picture with, an arrow pointing to a particle, right? That they just declare, boom, this is a new virus. And I'm like, what's going on there? And I ruminated on this for a couple of days, and then I heard this bootleg lecture that kind of went viral with Tom Cowan, and it was the one where he was talking about the dolphins being sick in the ocean, and he mentioned exosomes in there. And I had remembered that I looked into exosomes back in college when I was doing a big paper that I had to write for a scientific writing class about gene therapy. And they were talking about exosomes as one type of vehicle to get a gene into a host. Actually, it's also kind of ironic that I did that paper on gene therapy back, in the early 90s.
That is ironic.
And then I said, I wonder if the things that they're showing in this slide could be an exosome. So I started looking into this, and I saw that even virologists were saying that exosomes and viruses are kind of the same thing, or it may not be distinguishable from each other.
Right. Famous
virologists, right, who later, said they denied making those comments, even though it was in a written paper, like published.
Right.
But it was only because of me, saying that they said this. It was, it wasn't my idea originally, but I saw that everything was the same. And so I'm like, how could they tell one is one and one is the other? Because there was no specific functional test that they demonstrated that. And it was just, in dead tissue on a micrograph. So that's when I really first questioned it. And of course, I reported that. And people heard it and said, that makes a lot of sense. And that's what led me on the whole path.
Now, going back to exosomes, is your opinion that what they are pointing to and declaring as, quote, viral is really just, I don't want to have you make a positive claim here. I'm trying to, what is your opinion on viruses as it relates to exosomes now? And then I would also throw in there so-called multivesicular bodies, so-called extracellular vesicles, et cetera, et cetera.
So all the things you mentioned, and there are more that we could come up with, are essentially very, very small particles, on the order of around 100 nanometers. And a nanometer is a billionth of a meter, 10 to the minus ninth. So we're talking about super tiny things, and these size objects can not be seen with regular light microscopy. They can only be seen with electron microscopy. And at that time, I didn't know much about electron microscopy, but now I know a heck of a lot more. And it's really unclear when you're seeing these things under the microscope, are they real? In other words, did they exist in the biological organism that you're looking at, or are they just an artifact of the process of microscopy itself, which involves really beating the crap out of the tissue in order to be able to see it, because an electron microscope can't actually see carbon-based material. So you're not visualizing directly the biological material, you're visualizing metal oxides that are, like applied like a thin layer on top of the biological material, which is then evaporated with, ray guns, so to speak. And then you're just seeing the metal. So during that process were artifacts created. And if we look at some work that's been done out there, by Harold Hillman, for example, we can see that other subcellular structures on that order of magnitude size-wise are clearly artifacts of the process and not really part of the biological cells. So that question exists still with these, little roundish particles that we are, referring to as viral particles or exosome particles or multivesicular bodies, et cetera, down the line. Now, if they are actually biological, then we have no idea about, their origin, function, structure, et cetera, because we would have to get them completely purified in order to study those aspects, or at least the material composition and structure. The function, we'd have to observe them in a living organism,
right,
which we have no technology to do at that scale presently. But what has been observed is that these types of particles with the same size, the same shape, the same properties, even the same so-called, spike granules around the outer shell, have been seen in lots of different biological samples of different origin, but all with some kind of disease process. And I think this makes sense because, cells are compartmentalized to some degree, and they also have many, many chemical reagents in them, including digestive enzymes or, things like lysozyme, which can degrade proteins. They have DNases, which can degrade genetic material, lipases, which can degrade like lipids, like perhaps cell membranes. So if a cell that was dying released all these contents willy-nilly into the area, it could destroy surrounding tissue. So it makes sense that the body or the cells can compartmentalize essentially into trash bags to safely remove the debris from a decaying and dying cell. And you can look up on YouTube some kind of, I think it might be a protozoa, that you can see this process like in a microscope, light microscope. You can see it actually happening in real time. You wouldn't, obviously the particles have to be bigger in order to see them, but you can see the cell disintegrating into particles. And this has also been seen in human cells in a process called apoptosis, which is, the programmed cell death or natural cell death or senescence. So it could just be that these are damaged cells and they are starting to compartmentalize as they disintegrate, and that's all we're seeing. So there are many, many possibilities of what they could be. But from the current research, we have no idea what they are.
I appreciate that answer. Yeah, that summarizes exactly my thoughts too, because I used to buy into the idea that viruses are exosomes and exosomes are a communication network between cells, et cetera, et cetera. And correct me if I'm wrong on this, there have been some in vitro studies that are, I won't say compelling, that are just interesting as it pertains to so-called exosomes.
Yeah, well, with exosome, now, let's kind of remind everybody about the answer to the last question, because these are these tiny particles that we don't know what they are. Okay?
Exactly.
But in studies where they call them exosomes versus studies where they call them viruses, they can actually get them from biological samples and purify them in exosome studies. In fact, you can find papers which just outline different ways of purifying exosomes out of the body. Now, when they have a pure sample, one thing you can do is you can test that by looking at it under an electron microscope, because you should only see one thing, like a uniform pattern of one thing. And this is what you see with bacteriophages, which are, said to be viruses of bacteria. They don't clearly, they don't kill bacteria. It's not very clear that that's the case. But those bacteriophages have very unique shapes that are very identifiable. They look like alien spaceships. And when you culture them and purify them and then put them on a microscope, all you see in the entire field of the microscope is these identical, alien spaceship looking particles. And
still assuming that those are actually in the human body as they look in the human body, but still here because we're in vitro.
Well, those are from bacterial cultures, but with the exosomes, yes, they take blood.
Right.
And then they put the blood through filter. They might use chromatography. They might use ultracentrifugation with a density gradient to separate out these particles.
And that's the general point that I'm trying to make before you continue, is just to remind people that this is still riddled with a lot of assumptions.
Well, these are, physical means, right? You're kind of subjecting these biological material to physical forces, sometimes exposure to chemicals, solvents, things like that. So it is incumbent upon the researcher to do experiments to say, what effect do these procedures themselves have on the sample? Does it change it from what it was in the body? I completely agree.
Right.
But at least you can confirm that you have just one thing in your sample, whether it's been changed from how it was in vivo or whether it's preserved. It's one thing by visually showing that, a microscope field with nothing but identical particles. So that's been done with, particles that they call exosomes. And then once you have confirmed that you have a pure sample of something, well, then you can do different studies on it to say, what's it made of? Right? Like, is it made of protein? Is it made of carbohydrates? Is it made of fats? Does it have genetic material in it? All these things. And there are chemical assays that you could do to test those things. And they have done that for some of these particles, that they say are exosomes. So if there really were viruses, they should be able to do that as well. There have to be enough of the virus in the body to cause an illness, which, and what they tell us in the textbook is that a particle would invade a cell and then replicate itself using the host cell's machinery, and then burst the cell open, and millions of new baby viruses would come out, and then they would infect other cells, right? So if there are all those virus particles in the diseased tissue, we should be able to take those out and look at them and do tests on them. But those experiments have never been successfully done.
No. It's so funny because, as what I like to call, I get this from Jordan Grant, rescue devices, they employ excuses like, well, it's because there's not enough virus inside the fluids of a sick person, which is also funny because they then claim that there's upwards of 20 to 200 million virus particles in one sample of snot, or they'll say that the virus is too weak to isolate or purify, when they also say that a virus does all those things that you just described. It's just, it's hilarious how many rescue devices they come up with. But
well, the idea of that you have to culture the virus in order to have enough of it, like what is a culture? A culture is there are host cells, there's nutrition, and then that causes viral replication, right? Well, what's going on in the person's body who has the virus? There are cells, there's the virus particles replicating, and there's much better growth media than you could do in the lab because there's blood.
Right.
So that is a culture, right? There's a culture inside the organism already producing the virus. So why can't we just look directly at it? Why do we have to take some of it and then do that in the lab, except instead of using the cells that it's allegedly infects, like why aren't we using human lung cells? Instead, we're using the kidney cells from a genetically modified monkey.
Right.
That's kind of strange.
Right. You know, what's really interesting about that too is I know there are countless examples, just like you said, of people finding particles on, or pointing to particles on electron micrographs and claiming that they're viruses when they're clearly not, or admitting that, okay, this is indistinguishable from what virologists refer to as a virus, but it's clearly not viral, whether it's, someone The example that I'm trying to think of here, though, is I think it was published in Kidney 360, and it was appearances can be deceiving, viral-like inclusions in negative renal biopsies. And essentially,
August 2020.
Yeah, August 2020. And it's interesting because that was in renal biopsies. So it had to do with kidneys specifically. So I've thought about this quite a bit, and I don't think that we can ever find a conclusive answer on this. If it's something about kidneys specifically and their tendency to, kidney cells experience cytopathic effect and produce these specific types of particles. Have you thought about that before?
Well, that is an important paper, and it's not the only paper, by the way, that shows that. Right. And basically they had kidney biopsies of patients with various types of renal failure, and they were from different samples of different times, but they were far before COVID. Mm-hmm. And they showed, particles with the same, spike protein that were indistinguishable on the microscope, but said obviously they weren't, because this was before COVID existed and it's from the kidneys, not from the lung. I think basically whenever you have disease, because cells most likely break down into particles, that you're going to find particles. Mm-hmm. And, and they're going to, by the way, they're not going to all look the same.
Right.
One thing that people don't realize when they see these images, of viruses where there's a little square frame, mm-hmm. that what the microscopist had to look at was that frame times 1,000.
Right.
And they searched through all of that, and they found that one particle that looked like the particle they were looking for.
Right.
But on the 999 other frames in their microscope field, there were different things.
Right.
And they didn't show those. But I would venture to say that if you look at those, you'll find other particles that look like other alleged viruses that are point and declare, but they weren't important for this paper, for this purpose. The authors weren't looking for those. Mm-hmm. So they didn't show you those.
Hey y'all, I'm here with Melissa Kupsch from Remedy Academy of Homeopathy. We are so stoked here at The Way Forward to be partnering with Melissa and Remedy in order to spread the message of homeopathy across the world, and also to partner on the eventual development of healing centers across the United States.
People are pretty quickly coming to realize that frequency is the future of medicine. We are witnessing the great resurgence of homeopathy right now. We're really moving away from that suppressive medical model. Whether it's for eczema, asthma, hormones, fertility, anxiety, depression, trauma, whatever it is, it all starts as energy in the person's field first. If we change our field, we can completely change our life. Our 2-year academy is open worldwide to anyone who wants to become a homeopath. We've got 5 lecturers, and we currently have over 500 students enrolled, which is record numbers in our field. A career in homeopathy is amazing for anyone who wants flexibility in their work and who wants to be valuable in creating this new world. We have stay-at-home parents enrolled. We have ex-medical professionals, grandparents signed up who want to learn how to heal their grandchildren and pass on that invaluable knowledge. We even have husband and wife teams. So my husband enrolled in the course with no prior knowledge of health as a background, and he is loving it.
Kylie is also enrolled as well. So my partner is, and she's so stoked to become a homeopath and to be helping to spread this message across the world.
The thing that we hear from so many of our students is, I found my thing. Homeopathy is the key. We harness frequencies from nature and we alter the field of all creations. So if anybody wants to join us or they want to know more about it, they can visit our website.
Yeah, and all that information will be in the show notes. So if you want to learn more about Remedy Academy, also Remedy Collective, also some of the homeopathic products that they have, please just head to the show notes. All of that will be listed there.
Okay, so that's COVID. We can set that aside, and I've already talked about that like endlessly on this podcast and elsewhere, and people can look up videos of you all over the place. But briefly, and I mean briefly on this because I have so much I want to discuss with you. When did you make the jump from, so you're already questioning HIV and its existence because you were exposed to this information from Carrie Mullis and you're reading this book on the plane, then you decided to go look to see if SARS-CoV-2 had been proven to exist. When did you make the conclusive jump to, okay, actually no virus has been proven to exist?
Well, let me say, I actually traced coronaviruses back to the original discovery in a veterinary medicine paper in the 60s or
So-called
early
discovery.
70s.
So-called discovery.
But after doing that exercise, I think I probably read Virus Mania, Torsten Engelbrecht and others. And that, of course, talked about all viruses not being in existence. And then I just simply started looking at some other isolation papers. And many of the other, Team No Virus collaborators did this more extensively than I did. So I looked at their analysis, and sometimes I looked at the papers they looked at, or I picked another thing and found my own papers, and it was the same exact thing, right? And I discovered, and thanks to Stefan Lanka, really, that all of this came from John Ender's methodology, which was really a method of manufacturing vaccines. And that was turned into the proof of the existence of new viruses. But of course, it can't prove that. But it's been just repeated virtually exactly the same for every virus, since Ender's.
What's so crazy to me, though, in looking and reading Ender's paper, is that he admitted in his own paper that there is no evidence that this is the causative agent. He said something to that effect. I don't think it was exactly that, but essentially said that. But then he also, I wouldn't call it a proper control experiment or negative control in any case, because that assumes that the initial experiment had an actual independent variable. They did not adhere to the scientific method. There was no independent variable, but he did the exact same procedure, except he did not include any sample from a measles patient and got the exact same results. And somehow this paper was still the foundations that was ushered in for all of modern virology. It's crazy to me.
It's astounding. And, aside from, we COVID deniers, what scientist has actually read that paper, who's currently doing experiments.
Right.
But it said in there that what was observed in the experiment did not necessarily signify what was happening in the patient with measles. And it did, make the other point about you're right. It's not a strict control because it's not a scientific study, but you have the same experiment with no source of a virus, and you still see the finding that they say means there's a virus. Mm-hmm. So that must mean that other things can cause it, which invalidates it as an experimental procedure, because anytime you get that finding, well, was it a virus that caused it or something else, like in the original Ender's experiment? And the same exact thing occurred in the monkeypox original isolation paper. Not exactly the same, but in that study, they had, some monkeys that had the symptoms of monkeypox that showed, the evidence of CPEs, which is the finding, right, that they say means there's a virus, but also the monkeys that didn't have any skin symptoms also showed the same CPEs. But the authors, of course, didn't conclude that this means that we didn't actually find anything. They came up with a way to justify their findings.
It's insane. It's just insane. Okay, I want to transition to just sort of rapid fire questions here. And you said that we would be able to finish this episode in 2 hours. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's more so my fault. I added some questions in. Okay, so this question just seems to never go away. I know Sam and Mark have done a number of videos on this. I've done videos on this.
I already know what the question is.
Okay. What's the question that I'm going to ask?
Well, it's going to be about gain of fiction.
Gain of fiction. Yeah, let's go there. So the question is, though, even for people who are no virus leaning, right? Like they understand all the arguments that we make and lack of evidence. They'll say, okay, but what is going on in these labs? There has to be something going on in these labs. I know Sam and Mark have done videos where they do go over the published gain of function, so-called gain of function experiments, and show it's just a series of assumptions with animal models and sequencing, which is nonsensical. But what is your overall take on gain of function as it is, especially as it pertains to SARS-CoV-2?
Well, I mean, I think the most important principle here to look at this is that if we have something that doesn't actually exist in nature, how can it be replicated by man? Now, man can invent new things that don't exist in nature, but we would have to have clear, definitive evidence of that. And we do, because man has invented many things. And we have, these microphones here, right? We have evidence of their existence. We're using them right now, and they're man-made. So that's, I think, a very important thing to really think about carefully. But the truth is, nobody knows what's going on in those labs because they are top secret government labs. And I don't think any one of us has security clearance. Now, looking at the published papers, which I would have to say they don't really tell you what's going on in there, because otherwise, what would be the purpose of having top secret laboratories if you're just going to publish everything they're doing?
Right.
But what they published, doesn't give any prima facie evidence that they made some kind of biological weapon related to a virus. So, and also, if they did make such a thing and put it out in the world and people got sick, we should be able to have clear evidence of it. And there just isn't any. Now, some people might say, well, it's the gene sequencing. They found HIV sequences and such.
SV40 is another one they're saying.
No. Well, that goes back, to some specific vaccines, really, SV40, right? But it is said to be some kind of bioweapon. But, we should talk about SV40 separately, but in terms of these, man-made viruses, why don't we have evidence in the real world of these things?
People will point to effects and say that that's evidence, like I was sicker than I ever was, or they'll say that I lost my taste and smell. I covered loss of taste and smell on a recent episode myself, and I can link that in the show notes, but people will point to effects and be like, that's proof of the cause.
Well, I mean, I understand that, and when you experience an illness, you want an explanation of what happened, right? Because, maybe even you look at it as being unfair, or that you're a victim in some way, especially if you think that it's some kind of government weapon. But the truth is that, that you want to tell me that the only possible thing in the world that could cause the illness that you had is a top secret, government-made biological virus weapon?
Right.
That's quite a leap of logic.
Right. Okay, I guess we can close the book on that one. You have anything else you want to say related to gain of function?
Well, I mean, one thing about it is I think it is extremely dangerous because it perpetuates the belief in viruses causing disease. And it also, if you believe that this is a real thing, then any nefarious government at any point could say that they released something like this, and then, panic and fear can spread, that in and of itself can actually make people get sick, even die, the nocebo effect. Plus, it's justification now for, draconian policies, which are going to be much more, if it's possible, to be more coordinated than COVID because of the pandemic treaty.
Right. And I think it's such an important point too, because so many of the top voices on the so-called alternative side, you could say, especially as the mainstream media and mainstream pundits are losing all credibility, it's really a dangerous precedent to set to have the alternative side championing this idea that the government is making man-made versions or synthesizing man-made versions or weaponizing naturally occurring versions of these things and making them in a lab to make them more lethal and more harmful. That's actually a more harmful narrative than the commonly accepted so-called natural version of viruses, which is also untrue. But it's sad that the alternative side is championing this much more potentially harmful idea.
Fear is a tool of manipulation. And if you keep the masses in fear, they're much, much easier to manipulate, right? Mm-hmm. This is how the Patriot Act was passed after 9/11. But, the day before 9/11, there's no way people would have supported that kind of legislation. And any narratives put out by, the alternative media that generate fear, I think should be looked at with skepticism, on its face. I mean, there are things to legitimately be afraid of, but when, it's to that level and then that's the main story, it's probably not right.
Right. It's just unfortunate that it's like what needs to be done is rather than waking up to the fraud of, the mainstream narrative and then immediately latching on to the prevailing alternative narrative and blindly outsourcing to those pundits, it's people need to resolve their consciousness of blindly outsourcing, period. That's what needs to be done.
Absolutely. And, you are a great example of that because, the papers that I was talking about back then when you first got exposed to this information, now, you've read all those papers, right? And you made your own opinion about it. And I would encourage everyone to do that. I mean, it may be a daunting task to tackle every virus or the entire body of research, but, go and look into it a little bit. Look at one or two papers or read, something written in a little bit more detail to understand it, like the Sovi statement that I have on my website, for example. I want to, say Mark Bailey's expert edition article, but it's going to be too advanced for someone who's just looking at this for the first time. But that's where you want to end up,
right?
Reading and understanding that paper.
You can watch Steve Falconer's film rendition of it because Steve breaks it down pretty well in layman's terms.
Yeah, and with humor too. So that's an excellent source. But spend some time just thinking about it and looking at the facts, and then make up your own mind. And do the same thing for the gain of function. Mm-hmm. Take a look at the story, at the details. What's the actual evidence that this thing exists, not the rumor, or someone else reporting it. A lot of times too, there are these sort of quasi-mainstream, pundits or journalists that are just outside, or maybe they've been publicly rejected by the mainstream, and they're generally going to be feeding these controlled opposition type narratives.
Totally.
And so that's another clue that, if they're talking about, I'm not going to name names, but you can probably think of, a couple, some of them maybe even come from the conservative or libertarian orientation, which is generally much more on the side of truth.
Right.
And these folks, I'm not saying that everything they say is a controlled narrative. They say a lot of truth, but the most important things, and I know also because of the amount of censorship that I and others faced who talked about this, lack of evidence of viruses existing and causing disease, is that it is, among some of the most suppressed information out there.
Totally agree with that.
Whereas the gain of function story has been, reported on in the New York Times and mainstream outlets.
It's so interesting too. People will say that it was censored, therefore it must be true, like gain of function, or they won't say that directly, but it's sort of implied that, okay, this is information that was censored. Yes, it was censored for a period of time, but only after the mainstream media across the board, across the earth, seeded that amongst the population. Like I did a custom Google search from December or November of 2019 through May of 2020 and typed in several inputs: COVID, gain of function, Wuhan lab, SARS-CoV-2, these keywords, and you can find a number, dozens and dozens and dozens of mainstream articles openly talking about that idea. And then, yes, they censored it. And it creates this psychological effect of, okay, it's seeded amongst the population, but then they're censoring it. Therefore, I need to go look at that. That must be the true narrative. It's a false dilemma that they're promoting.
Try to find any article in any mainstream media publication, even, on page 76 in the D section on the evidence of viruses being lacking.
Right.
You're not going to find it.
Not going to find it. Not going to find it. Okay. Next topic that I want to cover is your take on ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. I think you've called it the double cross of the two before. Maybe that was you or someone else.
No, it wasn't me who said that, but that is pretty clever. I'd like to take credit for it. I think it's very similar to the gain of function kind of story because it brings you back to the pharmaceutical paradigm. Okay, so maybe you, are no longer interested in vaccines, but, non-vaccine drugs, those are still good. And, this whole thing is really quite amazing, actually, that it came about this way. But it makes sense, because you have this kind of appearance of a scary thing out there, and you're worried about your own health, and you don't trust the government solution, right? And so you find these other people offering another solution that seems good, but you have no reason to trust those folks either.
Right.
I mean, they're essentially strangers. I mean, I'm a stranger too. I say, I'm not going to suggest what you should do other than you should investigate these issues yourself and look into them. And, at the time when ivermectin was getting really popular, I looked into it a bit, and there were several, published research studies, like looking at people with respiratory illness. And even, some of the studies said that they were looking at COVID, but that's a whole problem that we can't define what it is and how, have a validated diagnostic test. But nevertheless, that there were at least people who clinically had respiratory symptoms and were mostly in a hospital setting. And when I looked at this body of research, and there were, about maybe 5, 6, 7 studies, there was no clear conclusion that there was any benefit whatsoever. That being aside, there's lots of evidence of toxicity of this drug. At the time, there were certainly things reported about fertility and neurologic problems. And then, as people were using this prophylactically, a lot of people got sick. Mm-hmm. I'm specifically talking about ivermectin for now because I have the most knowledge about that. But in the New England Journal of Medicine, there was a paper published from a poison control center because they got a whole bunch of calls of, basically ivermectin poisoning suddenly, which they didn't get before. And they followed up and found out that a substantial number of those calls ended up being in the ICU in the hospital.
Wow.
So we're talking very serious. Now, one individual someone I was collaborating with on some law project was prophylactically taking ivermectin and developed basically delirium and inability to walk, gait disturbance, which is a hallmark toxic sign of ivermectin toxicity. It took her over 2 weeks to fully recover.
Wow.
Yeah.
I know I've heard other people talk about, and I haven't looked into it enough myself, their correct me if I'm wrong on this, there might be some studies that show that it impacts fertility as well, specifically
Yes,
in men.
I did mention that originally, but yeah, there's lots of data on fertility with ivermectin.
Yeah. What about the people who claim to have had, well, they'll claim to have reversed COVID. That's the thing. But what they're pointing to is reversal of symptoms, that ivermectin cured them of what they were experiencing. What's your thoughts there?
Well, there's a very important reason why even the FDA, as crappy as they are, if you're going to get a new drug approved or a new indication for a drug, you have to submit clinical trials that involve more than one person. And the reason for that is because in any individual, anything you can misinterpret it very, very easily. You need numbers in order to see that the pattern is real and not just occur by chance. Because if you have an illness, at some point that illness is going to get better. Now, if you start taking a therapy and then you get better, how do you know if you got better because you were going to get better anyway? Because that's the nature of acute illness, is that it comes and goes. How do you know that that treatment had any effect? Now, you could say, well, the timing of it, right? If I take the treatment and like the next day I feel totally better, then that is a sign that the treatment worked. But that also could be a coincidence because that could be the natural history. And that's why you need like a few hundred people or thousands of people, because you could see, well, out of 1,000 people, did maybe 25 of them get better a day after the treatment and the rest of them didn't? And in which case you say, oh, those 25, it was a coincidence, and the other 975 had no effect, so it's not a real effect. Or did 900 people get better the next day and only 100 got better 2 or 3 days later? In that case, you can demonstrate this is most likely a real effect. So any individual, you can never determine that something or other, was effective definitively.
Right.
There may be few exceptions, like I mentioned before about benzodiazepines and seizure. So if you give someone an IV and while they're having a seizure, and then as soon as you put it in there, they stop seizing, like I think you could tell that drug made them stop seizing.
But even when it comes to ivermectin, let's say, because I've heard people claim this, that it immediately stopped their symptoms. When it comes to stopping symptoms of illness, and I would, love to hear your thoughts on this, and we'll discuss this later, the difference between detoxification and poisoning and symptom reduction and whether it's good or bad. We'll discuss that later. But I think in many of these cases, it's simply that the body is expressing detoxification and you're taking a substance that is stopping that process of detoxification. Possibly.
Yeah. Well, so with respect to like what are called infections, okay, like, colds, pneumonia, cellulitis, things like that, there's no drug treatment that instantly improves the condition, right? That's just not how that works. Like there are some conditions, like if you have an arrhythmia, for example, and you give someone the right cardiac drug, like if you have an SVT and you give adenosine, and it's kind of exciting to do this because you have to have 2 syringes, inject them simultaneously, and then right before your eyes, this arrhythmia turns normal. So you can get like instantaneous type of effects with certain drugs, but this is not what happens with antibiotics or antivirals or anything like that. Now, I think you're getting at, why do antibiotics seem to knock out, quote unquote, certain infections? And I think that there is a multifactorial potentially, because one thing is many antibiotics have been shown to inhibit inflammation. And many of the symptoms of an acute illness are caused by, they're a consequence of the inflammation. And you're right. So any, acute illness, the symptoms of acute illness are essentially your body detoxifying itself. And this should be self-evident, because if stuff is coming out of your body, that means your body's getting rid of stuff, right? We know this just from our daily bathroom functioning.
Right.
You know this when you're sick and you blow your nose or you sneeze, there's gross green stuff coming out, right?
Right.
Your body's getting rid of stuff. If you have a boil, it leaks out pus, right? It's getting rid of that. Now, whatever it is the body's getting rid of is less important for this, but the inflammation or the early parts of inflammation help the body get rid of stuff. So remember, the signs of inflammation would be swelling, right? And what's swelling? Swelling is more blood getting to the tissue. So that's really good because it provides more nutrients and it provides more fluid to wash away waste products. And so you get swelling of the nose, for example, when you have a cold, right? And that's going to be uncomfortable because it's going to stretch the tissues and make them kind of raw. And then you have all the secretions. So the fluid that comes there from the swelling actually goes to help make the mucus, which is the vehicle that gets rid of the waste products or whatever the body's trying to get rid of. Mm-hmm. So if you give a drug that turns off that inflammation, then there won't be swelling in the tissue. There won't be enough extra fluid to make the mucus, so the runny nose will stop, right? And that might seem like it's an improvement or a relief, or it might give you the perception that it is, curing the illness. But that's not actually what's going on. Now, the what you talked about is also most likely part of what's going on, which is if the body is in a cleansing or detox mode where it's getting rid of stuff, that's a healing mode.
Right.
And we know inflammation is a healing mode too, because inflammation has different phases, and the ultimate phase is tissue repair and regeneration, which is the completion of the healing. First, you have to get rid of the bad stuff and dead stuff, and then you renew, and then now you start fresh. And that's the healing cycle. Now, if the body is getting rid of stuff, but then you put in something really toxic to the body while it's doing that, it could cause the body to switch modes and say, you might say, oh, it makes sense to just dump that too, but maybe the body is overwhelmed by it and can't just do that easily. And also, if let's say you swallow an antibiotic, it's not going right to your nose where your body's getting rid of stuff.
Right.
So if the body says, oh, you just put a whole bunch of poison in, I better switch from cleansing mode to, emergency storage mode. And let me clean up this toxin out of the blood, bring it to a safe storage location so it doesn't go, to the heart or the brain or the lungs or whatever, where it could damage a vital organ. Now, this, by the way, this is mostly speculative. I don't have direct evidence that these things are going on. There is evidence of antibiotics being anti-inflammatory. So that is somewhat, evidence-based. But the thing is, because the paradigms of medical science are so ingrained and accepted as being true, like, germ theory, for example, that nobody's looking to test alternative hypotheses like we're talking about.
Totally. I think overwhelmingly this is another example of people pointing to effects as proof of the cause, affirming the consequent, where they're already assuming that bacteria is the cause of illness. And so then when illness stops after taking an antibiotic, they assume that must mean that this stopped the bacteria, the so-called pathogenic bacteria, from proliferating and causing more illness. Right? It's another example of that. Yeah.
Lots of circular reasoning involved in these opinions.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that you're pointing at there with like the antibiotic doesn't just go straight to your nose. It's not, I feel like people have this idea that antibiotics are specific and tailored towards a certain area of your body. When you consume them orally, they just go throughout your entire body.
Right. So I had a mentor back in medical school. I think this was Dr. Albanese. And he was talking about this effect, like that drugs, whatever drug we put in the body, like it might be targeted at part of the body, like antidepressants would be targeted at the brain. But of course, it goes to the whole body, right? Because we don't have a way. I mean, we can't, we could put a needle into the brain and inject it, but that's probably not a good idea.
Right.
So he made an analogy. He said, it's like if you were changing the oil in your car, but instead of opening up the cap and pouring the oil into the oil pan, you just poured it over the top of the engine.
Right. That's good. That's good. Okay. This question, and this is super rhetorical, but I do want to hear your thoughts on it. What are your thoughts on the people who say that it's not necessary to expose the fraud of germ theory, the fraud of the virology, and it's enough to expose the harms of vaccines, or to fight for safer vaccines, or expose the harms of masking, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, how are you going to know what to do when you have a health problem if all you know is what not to do? So you have to, understand that it's not just that antibiotics are toxic, right? It's that bacteria doesn't cause disease. So you don't want to think, oh, well, I should use colloidal silver to kill the bacteria instead of penicillin. You should think of what is really going in my body and how do I support my body healing itself? Because I think one of the most fundamental misunderstandings that we have about medicine and healing, and this is, directly attributable to the allopathic health system, I think, is that it's the medicine that actually does the curing or the healing. Okay, like that the medicine takes some kind of action. And I want to just remind you that a chemical is inanimate object. It's not capable of taking action or doing anything. We can't order that pill to make us a sandwich. And when we put it in our body is the only living thing that can actually take action. And any healing that occurs, right, if we recover from an illness, it's our body doing that recovery work. There's no other possible entity that can do that. Okay, so what is happening when we put a substance in our body? And this is true, by the way, whether it's a man-made chemical pharmaceutical substance, whether it's a vaccine, or whether it's an herb or something natural or a mineral, is that substance, we put it in our body, and then our body has a response to it, a reaction to it. That reaction might be, my God, this is going to kill us if we don't contain it and get rid of it. It could be, oh, thank you, that will help us with what we're doing right now, right? Or any of a number of other responses. But it's only our body's response that actually does anything with respect to our health and our physiology and our biology.
And that's what's meant by the body heals itself.
Yes, it's the only entity that can heal is our bodies. Or, perhaps for some of you, you might say that we could take that one step deeper and say that it's the action of God. But we certainly can't say that a pill or a chemical does the healing.
Right. So at the very least, it's important to understand the fraudulent nature of virology and of the germ theory as a whole, because you're no longer buying into these fictional things, and you can start to understand how the body truly works. I would say really begin to understand, because also the reality is the overwhelming majority of funding into research is going towards this disproven idea. And so I think we're just on the cusp of beginning to understand how the body truly works. And we're on the, precipice of a new paradigm right now, which is really cool and exciting. The other thing that I would add, though, too, just my own 2 cents, is that if you're focused on just fighting vaccines or fighting for safer vaccines or any of the other things that are built upon the flawed and fraudulent pseudoscientific foundation of virology, or really the germ theory as a whole, it's akin to whacking at the branches of a tree that continues to grow at its roots. And an example of that is we have these so-called bird flu outbreaks right now. How is fighting against vaccinology going to help us with the reality that they're culling hundreds of thousands of birds across the world? There's egg shortages. They're now saying that, quote, H5N1 has infected cows in some locations, and they're taking raw milk off shelves. They're killing cows in some cases. They're killing a number of animals because of these so-called viral illnesses. And it's not just bird flu. It's so many other so-called viruses too. Fighting against vaccines is not going to help us in that case. Not at all. The only thing that's going to help us, I would say two things, is understanding the fraudulent nature of virology and the germ theory. And then also you could say, and I know you're a big fan of this too, understanding that no men or women in positions of so-called authority actually have true authority over you. That's a whole nother topic that we could cover another day. But I think that it's incredibly important because of those reasons too. And we're seeing real world examples of that right now. Like people are at a loss for what to do when it comes to bird flu. And we even have, I won't name names, but a lot of, quote, alternative leaders who are sounding the alarm that, oh, this H5N1 version was created in a lab. It's like incredibly fear-mongering, and it's totally untrue and not proven. And it's not real. So yeah, I just wanted to share that as well, because I think that's an incredibly important context too.
Yeah, it certainly is. And, you know, if you look at the details of how this, bird flu operation is running, you'll see that there aren't like outbreaks of chickens being sick. There just is a test. Right. And of course, it's a PCR test. And whenever they give it to any population of animals, there are going to be some positive results. So they give it to cows, they're going to have positive results. If they tested puddles of water, they would have positive results. Maybe they learned this from, President Magufuli, who did this on fruit and like goats,
right,
with the COVID PCR test. But I think it's important to know about, and that this is, I don't think they're going to say that bird flu is transitioning to humans and there's going to be a bird flu human pandemic. I think it's going to be essentially with agricultural animals.
Right. I think it's more so about the food supply. That's
yeah. So there's an agenda known as Codex Alimentarius, and most people, even in the truth movement, have not heard about this. It's part of the globalist agenda. So it's referenced in the United Nations Agenda 2030, and many other globalist organizations talk about it to varying degrees. And it essentially is the theory that the average, Joe is not capable of safely cultivating their own food or medicine.
Hold on, real quick. I'm keeping this on the recording. Reese, Rebecca, didn't Ben just talk about this exact thing last episode? Codex Alimentarius? I'm almost 100% certain he did. I'm almost positive he did. Sorry, continue. That's crazy, because I literally just discussed this last episode. So continue though.
Well, it's good. Maybe it's timely because of the bird flu to talk about it. And there are many other areas where you can see this is coming into fruition and into policy. And so it is, based on this premise that, individuals are not responsible or knowledgeable enough to cultivate their own food and medicine. Mm-hmm. And this is, the reason why we've seen over the past few years in many countries as well. I'm not sure if this particular thing happened in the U.S. also, but that backyard chickens, right, have been destroyed or confiscated or culled.
Right.
So that takes away the individual's ability to grow their own food. Mm-hmm. Right. And where have we seen this play out, with the emergency in California and other places is, like you pointed out, they're taking animals that are going to become food and just killing them, to quote unquote prevent outbreaks, just based on the results of these testing. And already we were just shopping for some groceries yesterday, and, there was a very short supply of eggs. And we know this is nationwide. It's even been reported in the media. And you can see how this is not because there's some crazy increase in demand for eggs. And it's not because chickens are sick. It's because many of the egg-laying hens have been killed because of bird flu and destroyed. And this has, created a problem. And we saw, by the way, a similar supply chain interruptions during COVID, because what they did is they were testing workers at the, slaughterhouses and the meat processing plants. And then if they had a couple of positive tests, they would shut down the whole facility. And then the meat producers, the ranchers, had to cull their herd, because once they reached, harvest time, it was too expensive to keep them alive.
Mm-hmm.
And so once again, they just cut their losses, and then it decreased the food supply. And that's why, meat prices skyrocketed during that time. And there were lots of times when the shelves were not very well stocked.
Right. Yeah. So I think it goes without saying, it's incredibly important to understand this information. And on that note, why do you think so many of the prominent voices in the health and freedom movement refuse to touch this topic, and in some cases censor this topic? And let's set aside the obvious examples of people having a vested financial interest, whether they're selling so-called antiviral supplements or something like that, vested financial interest not to cover it, because that's an obvious one. Why is it that this is something that so many people just they won't go there, they won't touch it?
Well, I can't really answer this accurately, because I don't, we'd have to ask
speculation,
those
of course,
people.
right.
But I have a few ideas. I mean, one thing is, it's the material itself is a little bit challenging. Like, you have to really use your noggin a little bit. You have to think. And, I may, be a little bit glib about this, but really, for a person who is kind of not scientifically literate, and many people I know, most of my friends, right? They would, in college, for example, they wanted to, just take literature, or foreign language, or, history, or whatever, anything but math and science. So it's intimidating to try and understand this. Marcy Cravat, who is an amazing, talented filmmaker, we made a film together, Terrain, which, by the way, is still on Amazon. If anyone wants,
we'll throw it in the show notes.
Hasn't seen
Incredible that it's still on Amazon. It's amazing.
Still on Amazon. Yeah. The way that project came about was because we were on like an interview together. I think she was like the interviewer, and there was me and another doctor. I can't remember who it was now, but then she like got my number, and then she would be like, just text me questions. And so at first I was like, who is this? She's going to be texting me questions all the time. And so I said, read this book. So then 2 days later, she texts me. She's like, I read the book. Now I have these questions. So I'm like, she's serious. She read a whole book,
right?
Just because I told her to. So I said, let's have a phone call. And then, we had one of those 2.5-hour phone calls, and led to more 2.5-hour phone calls. And that's how we developed a relationship and decided to do this project. But she was, she's a creative, right? She's an artist. She views the world differently, from how I view it. And so she had to like reorient her whole way of thinking about things to understand this, but she was motivated and persisted. But it took hours and hours and hours, and plus the time for reading books. And then, she really, she totally gets it. And she achieved that. But I don't think there's too many people, who are willing to put that kind of effort in to really understand this issue.
That's what I think it is too.
So it could just be intimidating for a lot of people. And of course, you have these other folks, many good folks out there that, were heroes during COVID that helped wake people up. And they're not going there. So maybe they say, oh, well, if they're not going there, I don't need to go there. It's kind of a fringe issue anyway. And plus, if I acknowledge it, then gosh, that's I'm gonna have to change my life.
Right.
If I, do this, like if I get sick, I'm like, realize it's not gonna help to go to the doctor. What do I do then?
Right.
And that creates a whole lot of anxiety. Of course, you could say it's easy for me. I was a doctor, like I know what would happen and, all this kind of thing. Plus, I learned so much about natural healing. There's many other things you can do that would be help, but you have to know that they're the right thing to do. You don't have someone in a white coat backing you up.
Right.
You just have to trust yourself, and that you have to be really mature for that. You have to be able to face your fears. And so it's a real big ask. And then, what's the benefit? Like if you're...
I would say there's tremendous benefit, but that's just me.
No, I agree.
Right.
But there's also tremendous risk.
Right.
So let's say you're a doctor and you're still working in the system. You might not be able to do that.
Right.
Right? Like let's say you work in an ER and then you learn this and you're like, oh, wow, germs don't cause disease. And then somebody walks into the ER with pneumonia. Well, what are you going to do? Right? If you don't give them antibiotics, you're going to get sued.
Right, exactly.
Right? Let alone piss off people.
Right.
So,
right.
You're going to bust out the turpentine and,
Right.
or the enema bag, right?
We'll talk about that later.
So it's, there's a lot of risk associated with it.
Right. Right. I think it's a combination of all those things, right? Obviously, we have the people who have the financial incentives, which we brought up earlier. We have people who, it's just too challenging for them to touch it. We have legitimate controlled actors who are amongst what David Icke calls the mainstream alternative media. Again, I won't name names on that, who just don't touch it for those reasons because they're selling a controlled narrative. You have people who... And I understand this one specifically as well because I've been there as well, and it takes a shift in how you think. But the people who say, well, I don't have an explanation for how I got sick, or I don't have an explanation for how these two people became sick in the same space with similar symptoms, colloquially known as contagion. I don't have an explanation for that phenomenon. And because I don't have an explanation, I'm going to fall back into the accepted paradigm that the overwhelming majority of people believe in. And it really does take an incredible shift in thinking to get out of that mindset. And a perfect example that I like to give, and Tom uses the example of the adopted kid. I like using a fictional court case, but let's say Chuck is being charged with murder, but Chuck proves that he was or falsifies the idea that he is the one who committed the murder. Maybe the murder took place at a gas station in Wisconsin, and on that exact date, Chuck was in Jamaica, and he has all the evidence to prove that he was in Jamaica, thus falsifying the idea that he was the cause of that murder. What people are doing when they're jumping right back into the viral paradigm because they cannot figure out what is the true cause of their illness or what is the true cause of two or more people getting sick in the same space is akin to saying, well, Chuck, you know what? You're right. You have the plane receipts. You have, you had an Instagram live that day in Jamaica, all these other things. You have thus falsified the idea that you're the cause of that murder. But until you can tell me who did cause this murder, it must be you because this is the best fit model that we have right now. That's what people are effectively doing when they still latch onto this idea that, well, until you can come up with how this happened or how these things occurred, what is the true cause of measles, what is the true cause of chicken pox, like how STDs work, et cetera, I'm going to go fall back in this totally disproven paradigm. That's what people are doing.
Yeah, and this has actually been written about. If you look at the work of Thomas Kuhn, who's written about paradigm shifts, that there are these psychological forces, and they defy logic, of course, as many emotions are, but they also may have a protective functional role among societies. And there has to be a certain, amount of time, momentum, and acceptance before this kind of thinking changes, and people will revert back to the current paradigm, even if it's false. It's like whether it's true or false doesn't matter, because you came up in it and you never questioned it. It was already established, so you accepted it, which is why we have our compulsory schooling system, is to make sure that you accept all those things. And if we went back to a classic education like the trivium, based on the trivium and quadrivium, two of the elements of the trivium are sorely lacking in our population and would help them overcome these issues, which is grammar and logic. Mm-hmm. And, because really what you're talking about is flawed logic, or right, allowing your emotional response to interfere with logical thinking. Mm-hmm. And this is what happens during most discussions and interchanges around this topic, because you are attacking the most sacrosanct institution in our culture, right? Which is medicine. Mm-hmm. There's a reason why it's the highest line item on the GDP.
Right.
Right. And so there's this emotional attachment. Like, if this, godly institution is completely false, then my whole world is upside down. Mm-hmm. And that is too much, to face, just on the words of a couple of rogue, white former doctors.
Mm-hmm. What's up, you guys? I'm here with Matt Maruca, the founder of Raw Optics, to talk about something that I would say the overwhelming majority of people in the holistic health community totally overlook: light and circadian rhythm health.
All of our cells contain these organelles called mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. They make energy, they convert food into useful chemical energy. And it turns out mitochondria are largely controlled by our circadian rhythm. Our mitochondria are more active during the day under the influence of sunlight. When the sun goes away, our mitochondria have the opportunity to rest, repair, and regenerate when we're not being active. When it gets dark, the brain releases melatonin, and melatonin goes in and actually repairs the mitochondria, repairs all the oxidative damage that happens. Now, if we're exposed to blue light from all the artificial light sources, your phone, your iPad, your computer, your TV, the lead scientist we work with, Dr. Alexander Wunsch from Germany, actually calls it light doping. So people today are sort of being light doped by their employers with artificial blue-enriched lighting to increase their productivity at the expense of their health, mental health, and long-term health and well-being. And so just by being exposed to artificial light at night can actually have a massive effect on the body's rhythm, cellular repair, and overall health and function. So we designed lenses that specifically block these disruptive wavelengths of light. So that's why we created daylight lenses. They protect your eyes from the physical damage of short wavelength blue light, but also offer a bit of a protective and relaxing effect for your hormonal system as well, but not to the degree of the sunset lenses, which are designed to basically make you really tired and even kind of knock you out in the evening. So these are the two lenses we offer so that you can have protection at the right levels, in the right way, at the right time. And then sunset lenses, you wear these 2-3 hours before bed, or just from the sunset until sleep, so that your brain can register, okay, the sunset, it's time for me to release that melatonin naturally so I can wind down and not have to use alcohol, weed, sleeping pills, and other things that so many people unfortunately have become dependent on because we're constantly disrupting our body's release of its natural sleep hormone.
So if you want to take control of your light and optimize your biology, head to the show notes or go to rawoptics.com and use code TWF10 at checkout for 10% off.
I want to shift directions now and discuss what really makes us ill. I think we could cover that in like 6 podcast episodes, but just briefly cover what really makes us ill, and then also shift into what makes us well. And I know that you're someone who has really, dived headfirst into the research to form your opinions on these things. And that's why I have a tremendous amount of respect for you, because you don't just say things willy-nilly. You do your due diligence to look into these things. So in your understanding, what actually makes us sick? What can we say confidently makes human beings sick?
Well, I think it's good that you ask it that way. What can we confidently say? Because there are still many unknowns here, but there are some very strong knowns. And I think, for some of us, it's very obvious that we know inadequate nutrition or malnutrition will make us sick. We don't know the extent of that because we don't really appreciate what nutrition we need. Okay. But we know that fact. And we know that trauma, both physical and psychological, are insults to our body that require healing and can, manifest other complications. Right. And the area where I probably have spent most of time researching, because this was really almost completely new to me when I started learning about natural healing. But when I was studying other people's work in natural healing, and really I was trying to learn different processes or materials, procedures that folks use that resulted in excellent outcomes. And once I got a survey of what was going on out there in this world and being successful, I realized that what all these things have in common, they're all some form of detoxification or a way to help your body get rid of toxic substances. And this is a huge rabbit hole that I'm still exploring. But what I find is more and more and more and more evidence of particular man-made industrial chemicals, which some have known toxicity and some without fully known toxicity, are present in our bodies almost in every part of our body, and especially in the places where there are major growing health concerns. And some of these chemicals actually have been taken off the market or made illegal to use decades and decades ago, and they're still found in the bodies of children.
Insane.
Today, in 30, 40, 50 years later. And we can find also lots of evidence that anytime anything comes out of our body, we're going to find these chemicals present. So whether we look at an exhaled breath, whether we look at, of course, urine and feces, because we know those are our body's excretion mechanisms to get rid of waste products, but we can also find man-made poisons there, and we know we would find pharmaceuticals there, for example. But in semen, we find these.
Wow.
In follicular fluid, in menstrual tissue, in sweat. Okay, so essentially, every time something's coming out of our body, we find these things, and we find them in our body in areas that, at least population-wise, there's significant health issues. Now, what is missing is taking people with specific illnesses and finding them in the part of their body manifesting the illness or in their secretions that are occurring while they're going through this acute phase.
You say it's
illness.
missing, like not enough research has been done.
There isn't that research
Got it. Okay.
being done. So in other words, there's not clear scientific studies, but there is so much evidence of these chemicals being in the body and coming out of the body. And then with so many people having health improvements from making more stuff come out of their body.
Got it.
It seems to me like a lot of circumstantial evidence to make a case that these toxins are actually causing much of the disease. And I think there's additional circumstantial evidence because we can look back historically and see that many of these diseases didn't exist before modern industrial chemicals were introduced. Like,
can you give me an example of some of these chemicals?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The first heart attack in the United States in the medical literature was not reported until 1905.
Wow.
So there were no heart attacks in the 1800s and the 1700s.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I did not know that.
So looking at that, we have to conclude that some new factor that came into existence sometime in approximate years before 1905 must be responsible, because from no heart attacks, we then see, rising numbers to the point where it's one of the leading, if not the leading cause of death.
Wow. I did not know that. That's a crazy stat. That's crazy.
Yes, it is. And there are many, many other things like that. If you look at the history of autism, it really didn't exist until vaccines came into use.
Of course.
There was always rheumatism, but there were never these other plethora of autoimmune diseases. Of course, there was no AIDS, but that's kind of many of the AIDS defining conditions did exist before that. But, Lyme disease, many things only exist really since we've been exposed to all these toxins.
And what are these toxins that we're talking about, especially the ones that are ubiquitous and are found like in kids nowadays, even with some of them being banned 40, 50 years ago?
Part of the limitations of this research is that there are so many novel chemicals introduced into the environment that there really isn't studies available for even a small fraction of them. Mm-hmm. So a lot of this could be unknown chemicals, but there is one class that is known in the research literature as POPs, persistent organic pollutants. Mm-hmm. And this includes a couple of different classes. One is DDT and related compounds, mm-hmm. organochlorine pesticides, there's another type of plastic that was used in the electronics industry, but I can't remember the name of it right now, but that one is important. And then I think flame retardants mm-hmm. Is another category. Now would
glyphosate fall into the second category?
No. Glyphosate is an herbicide.
Ah, okay, you're right. That's a good point.
No, that's different. So now all of these persistent pollutants, they're actually all fat soluble, and that's really important for the persistence, whereas glyphosate is water soluble. So generally speaking, water soluble chemicals is much easier for our body to get rid of,
right?
Because our body is water-based. And so, if we're exposed to glyphosate, we should be able to get rid of it really quickly. The problem is that people keep putting more and more glyphosate in their body. And that's why it exerts, various toxic effects over time. But these are fat-soluble compounds, so they tend to be stored in the fat tissue, and they accumulate, and they have very, very long half-lives in the fat tissue. Like some of them, like decades.
Wow.
Can stay in there. And so these represent, some of these that are well studied. There's some other related ones like PFOAs, right, which are perfluoroalkyl substances. Those are the non-stick substances, and most people know about them from frying pans and cookware, but they're also applied to many textiles.
Wow.
For making things waterproof or water resistant.
Like
so
water resistant jackets,
your jacket,
like
other clothing, a lot of athletic clothing that is moisture wicking, and that's some even Paul Saladino exposed that Lululemon in their undergarments even put this stuff, so it's basically directly exposed to your genitals.
Insane.
So there are many, many, many of these chemicals that I'm not talking about, but those are, a couple of the of in that category that have been there. So they have like studies with fat biopsies where they find these things, in the 2000s, even DDT and DDE related compounds that were taken off the market in like the 60s or something like that. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mentioned, some stuff about semen, right? Because, one of the things I've looked into is we have a major reduction in fertility, and, we're actually undergoing major depopulation. Despite, all the things you've heard about overpopulation and, from Bill Gates and the like, it's the opposite that's actually true. And even the CDC has published in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly that we're below replacement levels in North America.
Wow.
Population replacement because of such low fertility. So I wanted to say, are there, toxins in the reproductive organs that maybe contribute to this? And so one of the things that's been found is flame retardants. I think MBTE is the class of chemicals. And then there's studies on sperm that show that sperm exposed to MBTE has decreased motility and abnormal morphology. So, we can see this, chain of evidence. It's not scientific, like I said, but these things are present in those parts of the body. And then in toxicology studies, they're shown to display that same type of toxicity that we're talking about. So, and we could, of course, do confirmatory studies, but, this is definitely an area that we should be very, very concerned about, because the potential that this is really what's causing a lot of these problems is quite high. And of course, also remember, I came to this from the knowledge that doing detoxification protocols is what results in clinical improvement, or, even complete remission from a variety of, so-called incurable conditions.
Who did you learn from in order to come to that conclusion regarding detoxification protocols?
Well, early on in my study of natural healing, before I ever, did anything myself or worked with a client or taught any of it, I was looking for anyone kind of out there who was having success. So someone introduced me to Barbara O'Neill. So I looked at a lot of her work. Of course, I read Kelly Brogan's book, which was, really instrumental in a lot of the things I did. I also, Anne Baroque, who was a young woman who developed MS and then was able to heal herself and then became like a natural healing practitioner. And she actually died very suspiciously and suddenly. One of those other natural health people who kind of mysteriously died.
So many of those. Right.
And probably most significantly, Dr. Jennifer Daniels, who I just listened to hours and hours and hours and hours of her podcast. Eventually, I did meet her and we did some work together, and it was just great.
Amazing.
So, those are like the first kind of wave of people that really, their material and knowledge really got me started on this path.
So correct me if I'm wrong, on some of these chemicals we're talking about being that they're not water soluble, they're fat soluble, and they have this crazy half-life where they essentially stay in the body for, you could make the claim, possibly for the duration of that individual's life in some cases. We have to, or it would behoove of us to employ detoxification methods other than what our body naturally provides. Would you say that that's a fair statement to make? Because these chemicals are not water soluble, they're fat soluble.
Okay, yes. No, this is what I found to be a very key thing. And it's probably more nuanced than that it's not just as cut and dry as water soluble, fat soluble, because there could, or may not be, like excretory or metabolic pathways that can handle a variety of man-made things. And then there may be other things that the body has no readily available way to handle. Okay, and I think
at least not on a day-to-day basis, because what I'm getting at, there's so many different approaches you can take. You've done a 26-day water fast. I know.
No. Listen, I'm gonna get you there. I just want to say that, like, for example, some heavy metals like aluminum hydroxide microparticles that's used in vaccines, for example, it's been shown that the body often reacts to that by forming a granuloma, which is essentially like a padded cell in the body to contain the aluminum because it has no way to process it or excrete it.
Right.
Okay.
And is that because specifically it is injected, not ingested?
Well, it could be the part of the fact that it doesn't, like when you swallow something, right?
Yeah.
It's, even though it's in your digestive canal, it's still outside your body technically.
Right.
And the body has that barrier of the, intestinal wall, the stomach wall, et cetera, that can protect. And if you ingest aluminum salts, you only absorb about 1%.
Mm-hmm.
So 99% just goes right through you.
Right.
When you inject it, 100% is inside you.
Right.
Right.
Makes
because
sense.
you've used that needle to pierce the barrier and go directly internal. So your body would have a different reaction. But also so with metals, okay, metals are minerals. We actually need minerals, right? But in nature, they're in a certain form. They're usually in a organic colloidal form, like conjugated to fulvic acid, like in plants.
Right.
Or they're in an inorganic mineral form. And there's also different oxidation states. But there are industrial forms of the metals that are totally different, right? And like, for example, trimethylmercury, which is found in, as an industrial waste product and contaminates a lot of food, is very different from, natural mercury that would be in the soil in very small amounts. And as such, being an unnatural form of the material, that our body may see it as something very different than the natural form of it. I mean, we don't really know exactly which minerals our body actually requires to live. It's one area that I'm really exploring, because I know that most of us don't have most of the minerals that we need, and we need to get those somehow. But even something like selenium, which now we all know is very important, and its anti-cancer properties have been highly touted, and it's considered universally an essential mineral. Well, in either the 1940s or the 1950s, it was thought of as just a poisonous metal, and it had no biological role whatsoever.
Wow.
So, now with aluminum, there are some scientists who think that aluminum is actually a required mineral in our body, but the form that it exists in nature that we would be exposed to in a natural environment is very different from, aluminum foil, aluminum hydroxide in vaccines, et cetera.
Right.
And so even though those things may exhibit toxicity, it doesn't mean aluminum itself is bad.
Right. That's a good point. That's a really good point.
Now, with the fat-soluble toxins that I was mentioning, they often get stored in the fat in your body, either in the belly fat or even in the fat around your organs, known as the visceral fat. And obviously, that's not a good situation, because that means those things are right next to your organs, so their toxic effects could affect the organ. There are some studies actually in animals and humans looking at how can the body get rid of these fats stored in the fat tissue, the fat-soluble toxins. And essentially, anything that results in lipolysis or breakdown of the fat will cause these things to potentially leave the body or go somewhere else in the body, and which you want to avoid. So there was an animal study looking at fasting, or they call it calorie restriction.
Okay.
And they found that a lot of the toxins did leave the body, but also some of them went to the other organs and actually caused some health problems.
Wow.
Now, I think it's because they didn't calorie restrict them long enough, but that's, not clear.
Right.
Okay. But there was a human study. It was relatively small, but I thought it was quite interesting. And it was out of India using Ayurvedic medicine. And what they did is that they gave essentially clarified butter, but you had to drink like a cup of it. And they did enemas. So they did like kind of a preparatory phase, and then they started drinking the clarified butter. Now, what that is, or how I would theorize it, is that it is a solvent that can dissolve fats. right? Because we know if you have essentially clarified butter is going to be in a liquid state at a lower temperature than solid butter because the butter solids are essentially removed. And so it could act as a solvent to dissolve these fat-soluble toxins. And they did demonstrate in this study that the people who did this protocol, they actually did come out of their body. So I think, that's where, and, I observed the healing powers of turpentine, which I originally learned about from Dr. Jennifer Daniels. But, I didn't know how it worked. And she had some ideas about how it worked, but also didn't fully know. And because no one, there's not like a bunch of modern research on this. But after seeing so many people have amazing outcomes using turpentine and then learning about this and then seeing these other studies, now my leading hypothesis is that it's actually a solvent. And I call it a healing solvent. And there are several other oily liquids that also have been shown to have lots of benefit. That I think these are all the healing solvents. And I think, my idea is what they do is they go in the body, they dissolve these fat-soluble toxins that are kind of stuck there. And there's two ways the body can eliminate them, by the way. They bring them to the liver. And if the liver can make them water-soluble, then they'll get reabsorbed and go to the kidney for excretion. Or they can actually go directly to the colon and be excreted. And this has been shown in some pharmacokinetic type studies, or where they've actually followed them see the stuff be excreted this way. And so DMSO, essential oils, castor oil, right? All of these essentially oily solvents, I think they all work this way. And they can be effective, essentially in different parts of the body where there could be this accumulation of these fat-soluble toxins that's causing symptoms or problems, toxicity of that tissue.
So in your perspective, is it just a matter of preference, whether you would like to, let's say you're someone who has come to the understanding that you have these fat-soluble toxins that have accumulated in you, you're struggling with so-called autoimmune conditions maybe, which I think are just like an accumulation of toxicity, maybe some emotional components, which I want to ask you about here in a little bit. But if you're someone who has nonetheless come to this conclusion, is it preference whether you want to do an extended water fast or try some of these other approaches with turpentine, DMSO, castor oil, etc.? Is that simply what it is?
Well, I mean, it's so first of all, what I've learned about, healing and such is that there's always more than one way.
Right.
Nature provides redundancy. An easy example of this is if we look at essential oils, where, if we go to, Asia, we might find frankincense essential oil, and we know that it has amazing healing properties, but it doesn't grow in Australia. But in Australia, we have tea tree essential oil, and that has similar healing properties, right? So nature has this redundancy built in. Of course, if we look to the animal kingdom, animals don't do enemas, right? They don't. Now, they might actually use herbs to some degree. Like I've seen my, dog and cat, for example, eating grass, which is not part of their diet, and they're doing it because they have some kind of, GI upset, I think, and it makes them throw up.
They're wanting to cleanse, essentially, right?
Yeah,
right.
So it's like taking Ipecac for them. So that could be like natural, but what universally animals do when they're sick or injured is they fast. So I would, in my opinion, because of this observation, I would say probably fasting is the most natural way to do things. And it is very, very pure and clean because you're essentially, not putting anything in your body and just letting your body devote all of its energy to healing.
Right.
But you have to do it in a careful way. You have to make sure you maintain hydration, and you have to do it long enough. And, experience has shown if you want to heal from it, we're talking about a minimum for a serious health problem of 3 weeks of fasting.
Mm-hmm.
When there was a 21-day fast tested in a clinical study with cancer patients, they divided the group into half because they couldn't compare chemo to fasting.
Mm-hmm.
They had to have chemo in both groups, and it was either chemo plus the regular diet or chemo plus fasting.
I hate that so much, but okay, it's what we have to work with, I guess.
They would have showed that fasting was superior to chemo.
Of course,
so
of course.
it would be against their interest. But
talk to Lauren Lockman, or not even just Lauren Lockman. There's so many other people you could talk to on this that have experience.
But the chemo plus fasting group did much, much better in their outcomes.
No surprise.
So that is out there. And, I think there's lots of different things that you can do that can be effective. And some people may prefer to do this. And when I work with clients and I'm teaching them about these different things, I always say to them, I'm like, there's always more than one option. I said, here are things that I know would be likely to be effective for your health issue. Here's 3 different things. What appeals to you?
Mm-hmm.
And because that, I know you're going to hint at this psychological component, but aside from looking at the psychological factors that may be causing the problem, either in its entirety or just contributing to it, there are many psychological factors that affect healing.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone is not invested or believe in the beneficial outcome of what they're doing, they're not going to experience it to the degree that they could, if at all. It's like you can sort of sabotage yourself if you just feel the outcome is predetermined.
Totally.
And so it's really, really important to face that. But there are also some things that will not, you can't do the same thing for every condition and expect it to work. Because remember I mentioned about aluminum and other heavy metals. It's really difficult for your body to get rid of heavy metals. But there are some things that have been shown that they do that.
Mm-hmm.
One of those things is sweating.
Mm.
So now you can get rid of a lot of things by sweating. Like there's good studies looking at the plasticizing compounds like bisphenols, etc., that those come out with sweating. Okay, but we know heavy metals definitely come out with sweating. So if you think that you have heavy metal toxicity type of issue, then you can do things that will make you sweat.
Mm-hmm.
Like saunas,
right,
or other things, or just intense exercise, or just doing what high school wrestlers do. Put on like 4 sweatsuits and start running and doing push-ups. Just make sure you wash those clothes after, because they'll be contaminated with heavy metals.
Right.
So,
do you think there's any truth to it's important to cleanse right after sweating? Otherwise, your body might reabsorb it through the skin.
Yeah,
I've heard people say that.
I do think that's a good idea. I mean, no, if you're healthy in general,
yeah. But if you're in the process of detoxification,
but yeah, I think that I have different ideas about bathing and hygiene, and I don't think we necessarily need to bathe, and we definitely don't need to use soap and shampoo and antibacterial lotions and things like that.
Yeah.
But I do think that we should bathe after a heavy sweat. Absolutely.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's so many other questions I want to ask you, but I want to also be respectful of time for yourself and the audience. There's a few more that I do want to ask though, and one of them is related to, I guess I'll just preface this with my experience with water fasting. I found the greatest, I guess you could say, shedding of toxicity for me when I did my water fast was emotional. And it led me to, I guess, deepen my exploration into the emotional causes of illness, right? Or the idea that our emotions and our thought patterns and our unhealed trauma is a causative mechanism in illness. And I'd already explored that before and already looked into it, but I think after doing an extended water fast, I really directly experienced that too. So the general question here is that Do you think that emotions, or that most illnesses have an emotional component or a psychological component to them?
So, in my opinion, our health in general, whether it's good health or whether it's a health problem, that there are three, components that are involved, right? The mind, body, and spirit, so to speak. And there are like typical issues, right, related to those different components. And usually there's a predominant component. Like for many people, illness, if we want to call it that, may be mostly physical.
Mhm.
But even if it's mostly or considered even 100% physical, it still requires attention to the psychological and spiritual aspects in order to have successful healing.
Mhm.
Because you're going to have to change your behavior, for example. So in order to do that, you need to first change your thinking,
Mhm.
right? You need to make a commitment, things like that. And as you pointed out, if you remove other stimuli, like, one thing that really, I don't think you can heal very well from anything unless you adopt a very, very clean diet of some kind, which
Mhm.
of course could be fasting, but we could just call it an elimination diet. And I'm
Mhm.
not going to say it has to be a specific type of elimination diet because I think there are options and my protocols have options.
Mhm.
But you can't keep putting junk in your body and expect your body to heal.
Right.
Now, most people, I mean, even myself, suffer from food addictions.
Mhm.
Okay. Mostly to carbs, but also to processed things, to artificial sweeteners, MSG, who knows what else. Maybe even, colors, things like that. We have an unhealthy relationship, many of us, with food, at least some of the time. And so when you're going through a fast, obviously that addiction is going to have to be addressed,
Mhm.
right? So it's going to come up. And then maybe other things you're addicted to come up, or, what is really behind addiction. If we look at the Canadian psychiatrist, I want to say Gabor Mate,
Mhm.
who's done some very excellent work on this. And if we look at the rat park experiments and such, we could say that social isolation or loneliness is at least a common causative factor in addiction.
Mhm.
So then are we confronted? Well, did we feel isolated or lonely earlier in our life? And then what resulted in that? Were we being neglected by our parents? Did we lose a friend? Maybe it was grief that led to loneliness, right? So all of these psychological cans of worms start to open up because of the deprivation experience of fasting. It really, and especially if you do it properly, because fasting is really not just about a break from food. You also need a break from activity.
Mhm.
So when you're just sitting there resting and letting your body heal, of course, you give space for all of these ruminations and worries and lamentations of the past to come into the forefront. And that's part of the therapeutic process because it's an opportunity for you to work those things out and realize that most likely, whatever the reason is that you're fasting, those were part of the contribution.
Mhm.
But there's also the other psychological factors that go with healing, like you've got to, stick to it. You've got to keep up the motivation and the willpower. How do you do that? Right? I've found that expressing gratitude gives you a lot of strength to follow through on those commitments.
Amen.
And then there's also your relationship to the healing modality. Like, do you honestly trust your body
Mhm.
to do, my view is that biological organisms are always trying to heal. They're always trying to re-achieve the balance, get back to the balance. Obviously, we have a finite existence, and the organism dies at some point. So it may also, something to accept is, when it's our time, it's our time.
Mm.
But there's so much fear that comes into play that can sabotage it. Like, oh, this couldn't possibly work, so it won't, matter if I go sneak a meal at McDonald's.
Mm.
Or like, I'm going to eventually have to go to the regular doctor anyway, because this is going to work. So if I take an ibuprofen for my headache right now, it's no big deal.
Right.
And these, if you have that doubt and that pessimism, it will manifest and it will sabotage your healing process.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying there's no coming back from that, because that may be what you need to teach you the lesson, and then you recommit,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're successful. But you don't ignore addressing these things at the beginning.
In nearly all cases with modern health systems, you're waiting months for appointments only to spend a mere 10 minutes with a doctor who quickly hands out a generic diagnosis that is likely rooted in a total misunderstanding of health and causes, and then you're offered a one-size-fits-all medication or invasive treatments with unpleasant side effects. If this sounds all too familiar, consider a different approach with the New Biology Clinic, founded by Dr. Tom Cowan, a respected natural health doctor, author, and speaker. Dr. Cowan's holistic perspective on health and wellness and a deep understanding of the true nature of health and disease sets this clinic apart. With the New Biology Clinic, it's not about quick fixes and suppressing symptoms. The practitioners take time to understand your unique story, recognizing that health is unique to the individual and that illnesses have a variety of causes, physically and metaphysically. Members of the New Biology Clinic enjoy a flat monthly fee that includes a range of valuable services like health consults as needed, practitioner-led live streams on diverse health topics, access to a members-only resource library, and multiple live group sessions every month. These sessions cover fitness, breathing integration, biofield tuning, guided meditation, EFT tapping, and much more. Unlike traditional healthcare systems that thrive on frequent visits, prescriptions, treatments, and suppressing symptoms, the New Biology Clinic's motivation is to make you healthy and keep you that way. Visit newbiologyclinic.com to learn more and use code THEWAYFORWARD for $50 off your account activation. If you're a member of The Way Forward, email hello@thewayforward.com to receive $150 off your account activation. Your journey to genuine healing begins here.
I have one more question related to fasting. And so maybe this relates to your opinion on water as it is. I know when you did your 26-day fast, you used distilled water primarily, if not exclusively, correct?
It was RO water.
Okay, RO water. Fine. But RO water and distilled water, and you maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong on this, are devoid of basically everything. It's pure water.
Just water.
Just water. Okay. And you did not use any minerals whatsoever throughout that 26 days, just RO water, correct?
We don't get minerals from water.
Okay.
Like, I'll tell you that there's osmolality, okay, which is how many things are dissolved in water. And this is used for biological fluids, right? So like our blood has 300 milliosms. So that's how many things are dissolved in our blood, like sodium and potassium and chloride, right? So they're minerals. So remember that number, 300. Now, distilled water is 0 to 1 usually, and RO water is usually said to be 0 to 5 milliosms, okay? Spring water, or mineral water rather, is 20 to 25 milliosms. Okay, so remember, we need 300. So we're not getting really, and also what minerals are in water. If we're drinking tap water, what are the minerals? Chlorine, fluoride, lead, those aren't the minerals that we need. So minerals that we need in the body traditionally come from food. In fact, if we look at some indigenous cultures that have very good health and longevity, we see this particular practice where they take the ash from their wood fires, so their cooking fires, and put that ash into their gardens because that contains the mineral content of the wood they burned.
Mm-hmm.
So they know it's very important to get minerals in the diet, but it comes in the diet through food, not through water. So if we drink pure water, we're not missing anything because we don't get minerals, from water to begin with. But what happens during fasting is that our body, provided we don't engage in severe physical activity where we have lots of sweating, because that we will have mineral loss. But our kidneys are very, very good about holding on to the minerals to make sure that enough stay in the body. And just by drinking just water with no mineral supplement whatsoever, no salt, most likely you're not going to have any problems related to mineral deficiencies.
Have you heard
Other than the mineral deficiencies you start out with, right, which you don't know about anyway.
I've heard of this idea from a few people that there are like different times in life that you want different types of water. And I have no way to validate this claim. It just made intuitive sense to me that when you're in a state of wanting to cleanse, you want to drink RO or distilled water with no minerals. But if you're not in a state of wanting to cleanse, then it's okay or even beneficial to have mineral water or remineralize your water. So you would say that there's no evidence for that, probably?
There's no evidence.
Yeah.
There's no need to have minerals in your water,
unless if you're getting enough
the only
from food.
place that you're going to get it,
right?
Like because you're just eating food devoid of minerals. Like I take Shilajit, right? I sell Shilajit. It is a natural source of minerals, and I often put it in drinking water. But just my one daily dose. The other glasses of water I drink, don't have anything added to them. It's just water. So yeah, there are a lot of myths about drinking pure water. People claim that it leaches minerals out of your body, but that's not true either. And I have a video on my channels that you can see that is just about that topic, where I explain why that's not the case.
Okay, cool. I'll throw that in the show notes as well. Last question related to water and fasting. So again, I'll speak to my experience doing a water fast. Granted, I was remineralizing my water throughout mine with Celtic sea salt. Don't know if that had any benefit or not. I felt on day 14 that I could have continued doing that fast forever. And I obviously don't think I could have done it forever. I'm not claiming that I could have been a breatharian or, claimed breatharian, but that's how I felt. And the only reason I ended up ending the fast early is because Kylie asked me to come home. I drove 14 hours straight and a series of things happened that I was like, okay, I can no longer continue this. But I felt incredible. And it completely shifted my perspective at that time on how much food we actually need as human beings. And it really made me consider the idea of breatharianism more seriously. Like maybe it is true that we don't actually need food, or that food isn't the only way our body is able to obtain energy to do work. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, you're kind of opening up a can of worms here, because we'd have to then ask, what actually is the purpose of food. But before I go there, and I do want to go there because I think it fits with another question you might want to ask, just want to say that, now feeling like you have tons of energy while fasting, that's not a universal experience, throughout the fast. It can be challenging. You can feel, weak because your body is healing. But almost everyone that fasts for an extended period of time knows that the food cravings go away after a few days, and then you don't really think about food unless some circumstance dictates it. Like when I did my fast, there was a period where I had to cook some meals for my kids, and that was kind of hard to do. And it didn't actually make me very hungry, but it was just, it made me a little uncomfortable smelling the foods and stuff. Like I didn't want to do that, but it was, I could have also kept fasting. I didn't, even when I started eating again, I almost had to like train my body to eat a little bit because it was just such a different experience. I would get full very quickly, you know, and, you know, I wouldn't have not eaten enough to sustain myself. So for those of you who are nervous about fasting, know that you only have to deal with food cravings for a couple of days, and then you'll be in the clear from that respect, even though other things might come up.
I can attest to that. That is true. That is true.
Back to the thing about, you know, what is the role of food? So we talked a little bit also already about food addiction, right? And, you know, many of the things that are in the grocery store are not actually food, right? Because they don't exist in nature. But what is the role of food? And you mentioned, you know, energy. So let me put that on the back burner for 1 second and first say that there is an obvious role for food, which is it is what our body's made of, right? So our body's continually renewing itself, right? Like making new cells, getting rid of old worn out ones. Depending on what we're doing in our life, our body can build new tissue. Like if we are doing a lot of physical activity, for example, it might build more muscle tissue, right? All these kinds of things, or more, you know, whatever, even if we're not children anymore. So we need raw materials for our body to use to repair and make itself. And that has got to be the primary role of food, because we don't put anything else in our body that our body can use as a raw material for building and repair. And so if you want to find out what nutrition we need for that purpose, you can just look at the body composition. What is our body actually made of? Those are the building blocks it needs. And, you know, NutraSweet is not a building block of our body, right? And many other things that we eat are also not part of our body composition. So I think that's the first guideline as to the purpose of food, and then what foods should we eat? Well, we should eat the foods that have the things that our body's made of.
One question on that is, I guess this is a not a good example, but I'm going to put it. This is the only one I can think of anyway. So, from my understanding, in a chicken's natural diet, there is not enough. I'm speaking of a hen specifically here. There is not enough calcium in their diet to equate to the amount that is in an egg. And I know that that doesn't mean, like, it doesn't relate directly to the chicken itself and what the chicken is made of. But the point that I'm getting at, there seems to be some sort of alchemical process occurring within the chicken that would make it so it can produce more calcium despite not having a ton of calcium in its natural diet, right? And so what I'm getting at here, and this might be a stretch, is that could it be that we can consume things that are not directly linked with what we're made of, that our body undergoes some sort of alchemical process to transmute that thing into something that is then food for our body as building blocks?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about, you know, just an alchemical process, right? Meaning that you start with one thing and then you transform that into something else. That's what our body does. Yeah. Right? Our body does that left, right, and through the middle. And, you know, if we go through a prolonged fast, and you know, if you did it for 3 weeks, you definitely experienced this. For 2 weeks, you experienced it to a lesser degree, that your tissue breaks down. Like you lose some of your tissue, right? You lose fat, you lose muscle. And you lose both if you fast.
Yeah, and claim breatharians, they're not really buff guys. They're very, very scrawny, almost like.
I don't want to speak about, because I haven't, you know,
that's why I said
analyzed
claim. I said
breatharians.
Claim.
No, I think there's some, you know, reality to that, because there's at least one who's been observed for extended periods of time in a hospital with around-the-clock surveillance. But I don't have the explanation for that. But I do know that your body, if you fast, right, it's going to break down your tissue, and then it's going to use those constituents, right? For example, We know that the brain requires some glucose or sugar for its metabolism, and if we're not eating, right, we are not putting sugar in, and our bodies only have a very small amount of sugar in them, and mostly it's in the form of glycogen, and that our body uses that up pretty quickly. So where do we get the sugar? Our body has to do alchemy. It breaks down proteins and turns the amino acids into glucose, called gluconeogenesis, right? Which is new production of glucose, is what it means. So that is an alchemical process. Now, the example with the chicken and the calcium, I don't know enough details about that to make a conclusion to say that, like the body can turn sodium into calcium or something like that. But certainly, if we look at, nuclear chemistry, we can certainly find precedent that one, atom or element decays into another element. So it wouldn't be that far-fetched to say that it occurs, also in the human body.
With the help of some chemical catalyst to make the process quicker, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of ways that you could hypothesize, but we don't know for sure. We'd have to have some pretty careful data to say that we're sure that this is a phenomenon, specifically. But it's not that far-fetched because we already have lots of precedents. But I think the other issue about food is very important to look at, that, food is a source of energy. And, then the only thing you could say that the only way you could have energy while you're fasting is if your body's eating itself. But I think that's really not the case, that we think metabolism generates energy, and we're told that the energy is in the form of a chemical called ATP, right? Adenosine triphosphate. Right. And that the energy of that molecule is contained in its quote unquote high energy phosphate bonds. And it could be harnessed by reducing ATP with 3 phosphate groups to ADP with 2 phosphate groups. And that's said to drive all the energy intensive cellular processes like maintaining the resting membrane potential. And that's a key energy drain, because that takes a lot of energy according to conventional biochemistry. And this is super important because all of our cells are actually like little batteries, that they all have a voltage at their boundary, okay, which is called the membrane potential. In other words, there is more positive charge on one side compared to the other, right? And this is what batteries are, right? And that's what causes electricity to flow, is having that potential and connected to a circuit.
Real quick on that, hold that thought. Do you think that what has been discovered about fourth phase water applies to the human body?
Yeah, well, okay. That's exactly where I'm going.
Okay.
So
I do too.
So we're told. So now one more thing about this membrane potential or this voltage is, we know that for our cells to be alive, they have to show this voltage. When our body's dead, the voltage goes to 0. In certain disease states like cancer, the voltage is decreased. It's somewhere between the normal value, I think, is minus 78 millivolts, between there and 0. Now, we're told that this membrane potential is maintained by a pump, the sodium-potassium pump, that pumps 3 sodium in one direction and 2 potassium in the other direction for a net charge of +1. And that's what creates this voltage. Now, a scientist by the name of Gilbert Ling did an analysis to try to calculate how much ATP, which we're told is the source of energy for that proton pump, would be required to just run the proton pump for a cell. Because ATP is also said to drive a lot of other energy processes in the cell.
Right.
And it turns out there wouldn't be enough ATP in a typical cell to even drive the membrane potential.
Wow.
Let alone any other process
right.
that's ATP dependent. So, in other words, what he's saying is that this is not what sets up the membrane potential. So, in other words, ATP is not the source of the energy. Now, there's this the evidence of these high energy phosphate bonds has never been established in a empirical scientific study. It's pretty much theoretical. And Gerald Pollack did an experiment, which is published, where he made like an artificial cell membrane. He used algal cell walls, and which was semi-permeable, similar, with the ions. And he added some things to the experiment and found that without any consumption of ATP, you could establish a resting membrane potential. Now, ATP was in the experiment, but it was not consumed. In other words, it was still present in the same concentration with the membrane potential. And this, of course, also overcomes concentration gradients. That's why it's so energy intensive. And so putting this together, I think we could say that no ATP energy, quote unquote, is required to maintain the resting membrane potential, which is the most energy intensive process of the cell. So then we have to call into question that ATP has anything to do with energy. Now, where does the energy come from in that experiment that Pollack did? Well, it actually comes from the sun and via the water, because what happened is that the membrane potential was established as a property of structured or fourth phase water, where we know that water can have charge separation. And what brings that about is the presence of hydrophilic surface, which of course exists in cells, and the presence of infrared light, which comes from the sun. So my hypothesis is that the energy of the body comes from the sun and not from food. And that food is the raw materials, the substrate for the processes, but not the source of energy.
So one question there, you said food is the substrate. Do we
for metabolism, right?
For metabolism, right? But it's the building blocks for our body, essentially.
Yes.
In that case, and this is relating, let's play with the assumption that breatharianism is real. When we have one confirmed case of a guy who's in a hospital, let's play with that assumption for a second. I know that's a massive assumption. If we're playing with that assumption and food is a substrate, then do we need to consistently introduce more food? Is it actually a necessity?
Well, certainly if someone can really live without eating or drinking, that would raise the question, right? Because how could they stay alive and maintain health, under that condition? So I don't really know the answer to that, because there's so few people who have done that. How do we we can't turn them into guinea pigs, just to get an answer to that. But, if you just think about it logically, every time there's damage to our body, like forget about even, it's pretty well accepted that our body is constantly remaking itself, right? I think something like in 7 years, every cell in our body is different from what it was 7 years prior. Okay, but just put that aside. You go through life and, you get a little cut on your finger, you bruise your knee, right? You stub your toe. You can't prevent these little things from happening. And each time that happens, even though it's a very small scale, there's destruction to the tissue that then has to be, removed and then rebuilt. Now, perhaps the body goes into some kind of conservation state where anything that's damaged is recycled and used for the repair. That's possible. What is the state of health of those folks? What are they able to exercise? Do they have any muscle mass? You'd have to ask a lot of those kinds of questions, to really know. But one thing like that I think is going on that's somewhat related is that, you know, the average individual who, you know, eats the standard American diet and has the standard American couch potato type lifestyle, many times when they get a serious injury, and I learned about this from my experience in the workers' compensation system where people have work-related injuries, that I've seen many times that these injuries don't heal properly and they become a chronic site of pain, unresolved inflammation, agony, dysfunction. And this goes on for years. I'm not talking about like, you know, just a few months. It doesn't heal quite as quickly. I'm talking about this is a chronic, persistent type of state. So my thoughts about that are that at the time the injury occurred, that individual didn't have the right raw materials in their body to repair the tissue. And, you know, one of the main constituents for that purpose is collagen. And in order for our bodies to make enough collagen, we really need to eat a lot of the amino acid glycine, which is mostly found in animal collagen. And we need copper and a few other things, like we need some lysine as well. And so if they don't have that collagen per se, so now their body doesn't have enough material to put the scaffolding for the tissue repair. But the body has some stuff that it's storing. Maybe it has some of those fat-soluble toxins. Maybe it has some heavy metals somewhere. And maybe it brings those things to the site of the injury because that's all it has to use, right? It would be, you know, kind of like you're on a boat and something breaks and you don't have things to fix it, but you got a roll of duct tape. And, you know, you can fix almost anything temporarily with duct tape. So kind of think about it like this. Our body has duct tape and it's using duct tape to fix it. And that may work to some degree, but it's never 100%.
Got it.
Right? So, you know, that would, of course, you know, if that's what's taking the place, then that would argue that you do need to keep, you know, consuming some of these resources in order to carry out these functions optimally. So maybe if they have this like conservation and recycling mode, maybe they can stay alive, but maybe their health will be a little bit less than optimal.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I think that's fair. Especially because you look at people who claim to be breatharians, and I will say they don't look like I would prefer to look like. Like, I don't deny that it's an incredible example of what the human body is capable of. But I typically like to have a little bit more weight on me than they typically have on them.
Right. And you know, also like, I mean, have any of them done this for 50 years?
Right. I don't know. I'm sure there's people who've claimed that.
I mean, I know someone who I met in person who did this for somewhere between 6 and 12 months, but described it as an extremely dark time for them.
Really?
In fact, they were so uncomfortable talking about it, it was hard to even get a lot of information about it.
Really?
But they suggested that they knew one or two other people who did this also had a very dark things going on with them. So I'm not going to generalize that in any way,
right?
But just I wonder, is it sustainable beyond a certain amount of time? Or only for, you know, a limited time. I mean, most people underestimate how long we can go without food. You know, you see, for example, like on a TV show or a movie, right? Somebody gets stranded or lost in the woods, and the first thing they worry about is a meal.
Right. That
you don't need to worry about that for weeks.
Right.
You know, you'll be fine.
Right.
You need to worry about getting a source of water. So, you know, maybe it's not that you can go for weeks. Maybe you can go for a year or two. And maybe everyone can do that, you know, if they do it right or have certain preconditions or a certain health status when they start.
So another question related to water, then I want to talk about diet, because I know you've run an online educational event where you interviewed experts across various dietary preferences. And I want to hear your takeaways on that and how you choose to eat. But last question I have related to water is, so from my understanding, the Hadza people in Africa, or at least like this specific group of Hadza people that my friend Brian Sanders had the privilege of spending a lot of time with, and I've heard other people make similar claims as to what I'm about to say here. When he was with them, he found that they barely drank any water at all. And I've thought about this quite a bit, and I've come to the conclusion, and this is sort of my hypothesis, if you want to call it that the reason we in the West, or in, I guess you could just say, modern society, are requiring much more water than, say, the Hadza people who are living in nature require, is because we're exposed to so many more toxins and non-native electromagnetic fields that are destructuring the fourth phase water of our body, causing cellular turnover. I don't know if that's the appropriate word, but for lack of a better word, cellular turnover, which requires us to add more water to our bodies to maintain cellular integrity and health. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, that certainly is a valid hypothesis to say if we're exposed to more toxins that our bodies has to get rid of, it has to do more excretion, more sweating, more urination, more getting rid of water in the stool. So that's valid. I don't know if that's the real reason or not.
Right.
But I would certainly consider that. But there are a couple other things that you might not consider. And one is that we don't just get water from drinking water. We also can get water from food.
Right.
If we eat raw food, we get a lot of water. When we eat cooked food, it's much drier. And sometimes some foods are so dry that we need to drink water with them. And the most dry foods are things like baked goods, by the way, like cookies. Because, we cook the water out of them.
Dipping cookies in milk, because I like to have a little bit of moisture there with it.
Right. Because otherwise it'll make you salivate a lot, right? And that's drawing water out of your body.
Right.
So I would, one, look at their diet. If they're eating a lot of raw food, then they're getting more hydration from that food than the typical American person. So that could explain partly or fully also why they need to drink less water aside from that. And then the other thing is depending on their diet, because the metabolic end product is water. And there's more of it if we're on a fat metabolism. So if people are eating more of a keto type diet, and I'm not sure they do in that culture, but in Inuit culture, that is their diet. Well, then their body's actually making more water internally. So from that, from the food source, from the fat, essentially. So that may be, part of the reason as well, depending on the diet.
That makes sense. Yeah, and I think from my understanding, the Hadza people have a primarily animal-based, but then also root vegetable diet, I think.
Right, and the root vegetables may not be available year-round, so they might. I mean, this is, actually some of the dietary analysis of some of these cultures was made in error because some of the locations of these cultures are not, they're difficult to get to, like they're in mountainous regions, and during the winter, no one can really access it. So they go in the summer, and then their diet's very different seasonally, right? Because if you're living based on local food, that's a necessity. There's no grocery store where they can get, plants from South America. So some of the anthropologists reported on their diet, they didn't take into account that they were there during that season when the diet was very different from most of the rest of the year.
Makes a lot of sense.
But that's been looked at, and there are sources of information where you could find out, what the real diet is. And in regions that are not equatorial, that are harder to cultivate plants, they're most of the year it is largely a meat and dairy based diet for many of these cultures.
Yeah, so that leads me to my next question. After doing this online educational experience that you ran, what was it called, by the way?
Decoding Diets.
Decoding Diets. What a clever name. Did you come up with that?
I think I did, yeah.
Okay, that's a good one. Decoding Diets. what were your key takeaways? You interviewed Dr. Robert Morse, you interviewed other people who were more on the vegan, fruitarian side of things, and then some people, I presume, who are vegetarians, and then people who are carnivore, more Weston A. Price approach. You interviewed people across the board, correct?
We had the full gamut because I wanted to, everyone to show their best evidence and, and then see what we can take away in terms of conclusions. And, I think obviously some people presented evidence that wasn't very good, very strong, but they're also, we've got this main issue about the human diet because we can observe other species of animals and we just watch what they eat and we say that's their natural diet, right? That's their species specific diet. But we are not, living in nature where we know what our natural diet is.
Right.
If there is one even, right? I would say there probably is one, but it's kind of impossible to tell by the routine methods. Now, there are people in this space that look at all different kinds of evidence. Like some of them look at, alleged ancestors of man, right? Like, Cro-Magnon man or Neanderthal. And they look at, fossils or bones and carbon dating and other isotope analysis. And I'm a little bit skeptical of the validity of some of that research, although some of it may be, good. I mean, supposedly they can tell, like, if you ate, marine animals versus land animals from these analyses. And then you have, I think more interestingly, the analysis looking at our anatomy and physiology and compare it to animals. And I think there's some interesting things there, like obviously we don't have 4 stomachs, right? We can't digest cellulose in any way. We also don't exactly have the anatomy of carnivores, like we don't have, large canine teeth. We don't have really short guts like lions do.
But then we also have sufficient hydrochloric acid.
Well, yeah. So
right?
I think the acidity of the stomach is one of the most interesting things to look at because our stomachs are highly acidic, like pH 1 to 2 range. And do you know what kind of animals have that?
Typically carnivore or what?
So scavengers.
Really?
Carnivores aren't quite as acidic. So scavengers are that degree of acidic. And there is a theory that that humans actually got their survival advantage as scavengers from being able to use like primitive tools to like crack open the skull and the spinal cord of carcasses that the other animals couldn't eat to get the high fat, high cholesterol nutrition of the bone marrow and the brain tissue.
Wow.
So, I think that's interesting. I don't know if that's really true or not, but think about humans as scavengers. And then, there is a raw, sour meat movement, right? Where people eat
high meat,
essentially rotten meat.
Yeah.
And they're in very good health. Like I met a guy from Europe who was living this lifestyle and he was in amazing, shape. And he said he really liked the taste of it. So, there's a lot of interesting aspects to look at. I don't think anyone had the conclusive, right answer as to what we're supposed to eat. But for me, there's 2 areas other than looking at, people eating this way, how is their health? And also like there can be diets that are good for healing purposes, but it doesn't mean it's a diet you should stay on for the rest of your life.
Like cleansing,
so,
like juice
yeah,
cleansing.
like elimination diets.
Right.
Like I think, for example, some types of carnivore diets like the lion diet or the B and E diet can be excellent for healing purposes. And they are, you can sustain those indefinitely. They do provide adequate nutrition. But do I think that's how humans ate originally? Probably not. And also you can do a raw vegan diet, can be an excellent elimination or cleansing diet. But if you try to stay on that, you'll be malnourished.
Totally.
at some point.
We see so many people that have that example.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm talking about, what is the diet that we're meant to be on, for our lifespan? And I think there's two things to look at to inform that the most, but these aren't conclusive. But this is my opinion. It's a little different from what most people out there are talking about. And one is actually looking at the body composition, because we know our bodies are made of food. They have to be. They can't be made of anything else. So shouldn't we be eating the same things that our body is actually made of? Mm. And it's largely proteins and fats. Mm. And there's some minerals and vitamins, but there's almost no carbs. So, I could say that we probably don't need very many carbs, if any at all.
What's also interesting too, because going back to the idea that food is energy, and that's what I was getting at earlier, that was one of the first things that I questioned, because I always, as an athlete growing up, was told that, like, even in worst cases, like, yeah, go to Papa John's after practice because you need to refuel for practice the next day, and get a big pizza because you need a bunch of carbs. You need carbs for energy. That's what people claim. And that was one of the first things that I thought of afterwards. I was like, is that actually true? Like, I don't think this is true. It doesn't feel true to me. And then I played around doing sometimes raw carnivore diet, sometimes just normal carnivore diet, sometimes more Weston A. Price nourishing tradition, a little less on the breads and grains that they allow in that diet, but sometimes doing paleo. And I've come to the same conclusion that I don't think that we necessarily need carbs for energy. I don't think that's true.
You might be interested in listening to what Dr. Anthony Chaffee said about this particular issue, because he used to be a professional rugby player. Mm-hmm. And he also learned, that to carb load and all that stuff. But at some point, he tried fasting, like not a prolonged fast, but just like, on game day, like your game is at 4 p.m., you don't eat anything that day. Mm-hmm. Until after the game. And he found that he had objectively better performance doing that.
Wow.
And he continued that. And I do think, so I do that as well when with my workouts. Like, I always work out on an empty stomach. Mm-hmm. And then eat afterwards. Same. And I feel like that I perform better
totally
doing that. Actually.
Totally. And it makes sense because your body uses energy to digest, so you're not going to have as much energy for that activity.
Well, the thing is, when you need a burst of energy, your body is going to break down your glycogen, mm-hmm. right? And this is why you don't need to eat first thing in the morning, because that's what your body is doing, is it's breaking down glycogen in the first hours of the day. And that's the natural way that, you have the metabolic function that you need for that time of day. You don't need to be putting extra stuff in your body then. And also, don't forget that, the body does use some sugar. Like, there are a couple of organs that need glucose for their metabolism, like the brain. But our bodies make it no problem, mm-hmm. right? Not just from breaking down glycogen, but, from gluconeogenesis. And there's a couple of other pathways to make glucose. So that's why, you can eat a 0 carb diet and be just fine. You're not going to, have low blood sugar. You look at your blood sugar, the value is going to be normal, because your body always, keeps that balance. But so you don't need it to get it from the food.
So from my understanding though too, Paul Saladino was originally like full bore on strict carnivore for some time. And then he claimed, I think, to start experiencing negative health effects associated with that, and so then he started adding a lot more fruit into his diet. What's your opinion on that after interviewing these people across the board?
I mean, I don't think that I know, or maybe I don't even know if Paul really knows what happened to affect his health during that time, because there's tons of carnivores out there who are very vocal about it. And they're not having the same problems. So I don't know what it was. A lot of people have theories, but I think that's kind of silly, because there's so many individual things that can happen, without knowing the individual factors. Really, it's not an informed opinion. But where I was going with this was, in addition to the composition of our body, I think another way to inform us about this is to look at some peoples around the world that were not influenced by the agricultural revolution and who have very good health and longevity, and look at what they eat. And there are numerous studies of those cultures that are published in different places, and Weston A. Price is one example of the work, but there's a lot of other anthropologists and scientists who have done this kind of work as well, although a lot of this information is kind of suppressed.
Of course.
But we can see that lots of people have lived well beyond 100 years, even perhaps beyond 150 years, but certainly between 120 and 150, there are many, many documented examples, some of them even followed by official bodies like the Chinese government and other governments. In fact, there's in a geographic area in Russia that has a lot of folks who are centenarians, and the Russian government doesn't allow outside scientists to interview them. So you have to look for Russian publications to learn more about them, but they're known about in people who study this. And if we look at those folks, we can, there's other factors besides nutrition, but if we look at the nutrition, what we see is that they don't eat any processed foods. They eat foods that are local to their geographic area. They seem to have a combination of that they may plant and grow some of their own foods. They harvest wild seasonal plant foods, and they may raise their own animals for food, and they also may hunt wild animals. And usually a combination of all these things. They eat seasonally because they don't have ways of processing and preserving, the food to make up their whole diet. I'm not saying they don't preserve anything. I'm sure they, may ferment and pickle things and or may dry things to preserve them. But, they generally eat things seasonally when they're abundant and only have a little bit of it to last throughout the year. And then mostly they're going to rely, on meat and dairy throughout the cold seasons in many of these areas. And so I think that really makes sense. If you think about what humans, were like before they had organized societies and agriculture, what could they do? They could hunt, right? Now, they would have to, capture and cultivate an animal to have dairy. So they probably didn't include dairy, but I know lots of people have very good health when they include dairy in their diet. Yeah. So, and obviously we do consume human dairy, at least during infancy and childhood.
Yeah. And I understand the argument too, that it's only intended to be for baby cows and not intended to be for human consumption, but I still drink raw milk. I feel okay.
And the other thing to consider is the particular plants that we know as food now bear very little relation to what they were in wild in nature. And if you want to get a good idea of this, like look up the brassica, the original cabbage that all the brassica vegetables were engineered from. And obviously they weren't engineered by, laboratory GMO. Right. But it's still GMO because they were hybridized and crossed, selectively bred, right, to create these things. And some of this is still going on. Like when I was a young kid in the 70s, everybody hated Brussels sprouts. They were bitter and yucky. And now it seems everybody loves Brussels sprouts. And turns out that there was a farmer in one of the European countries who bred a new Brussels sprout that was sweet, had a much higher sugar content, and now almost every Brussels sprout that's cultivated around the world is a clone of that, that exact Brussels sprout, and much sweeter, and that's why they've become, more popular. In my property, we have this like wild grapevine that grows along some of the trees, and it seems to maybe even damage some trees sometimes, maybe the ones that are unhealthy. But they're edible, of course, they're grapes. And so sometimes when they're in season, we pick them. And I kind of feel like this is what fruit was like for people before agriculture and crossbreeding and hybridization of
You could almost say
cultivation
it was
of
like
all these plants.
supplementary.
Yes. And
Right.
so eating these grapes, now they did taste good. Like you want to eat a bunch of them, but you part of the reason why you want to eat more is because there's so little you get out of each one, because they've got like a big pits that take up most of the space. So there's very little flesh or juice there, and it's not sweet at all, very sour. And so if you're eating the grapes themselves, they're just sweet enough to taste pretty good, just all the pits, and then you got to keep eating more to get like a nice mouthful. But we tried to make juice out of them, and it was so sour, it was like unpalatable.
Ugh.
And it was so much work to separate it from the skin and seeds too. So, like if that is like a big treat when it's in season, like I could totally see that, but you get tired of dealing with that year round.
Totally.
And I think that's a lot closer to what it was like, that at least before agriculture, that there'll be all kinds of, there'll be fruit trees and berries, many of which are poisonous, but we learned which ones we can eat, like the blackberries and the boysenberries and raspberries, and whatever they were like before they were made a lot sweeter through, agricultural technology. And, you would eat those, maybe you dig up some roots, because they make you feel full. They might provide some hydration. Maybe you don't have, you've been on a hunt, but you're not successful, and it'll tide you over until, you get the meat. And maybe you collect some things, maybe you collect nuts, and, because those will last a longer time, and you keep those for the lean months, just like the squirrels do. Right. But that principally, the vast majority of your food is from the hunt.
Yeah, I think that all checks out. Makes sense. So you would say that it's probably not natural for some dude living in an apartment in Chicago to be eating primarily mangoes. I mean, we have so many examples of this in the U.S., all jokes aside, like I'm not going to say what people should and should not eat, but I think there is something to be said about eating locally and seasonally and following the natural rhythms, looking around you, seeing what nature's doing. What are all the animals doing outside? They're consuming what's around them and abundant naturally in their environment at that point in time. And I think it makes sense that human beings did that too, with the understanding that we do have the ability to higher degrees to imaginate, to critically think and problem solve, where I'm not saying animals can't do that, but to degrees that animals can't. And that can be for better and for worse in some cases. So I think that applies when it comes to diet. Okay, we've been going for a long time. So as a final question here, what would you say, and then this is a big one, this could be a whole episode in and of itself too, but just as best as you can, are the primary things, as you analyze the state of the holistic health movement at this time, the primary things that the holistic health movement gets wrong or overlooks?
Yeah, well, this is actually I think a pretty easy question to answer, because I think a lot of the so-called alternative health movement or industry or whatever you want to call it, they're basically adopting the same model as allopathic medicine, but substituting, different substances or different tests. So like instead of getting the typical blood test, they get more exotic blood tests, like testing for organic acids or like the level of every vitamin in your body, or doing heavy metal testing as a routine. These kinds of things. Sometimes even use divination machines for the testing. And then, so you do a test, which is a moneymaker. It gives you the cause or the diagnosis. And then based on that, then you sell supplements, right, which are drugs.
Hold on. I got to stop you. Cause in air quotes there. Gives you the cause or the diagnosis in air quotes, because it's overwhelmingly not true.
No. Yeah, of course, because that's, there are many, many sources of error and steps
I just had to say that because I don't want people to overlook.
It's a good point. But, then they'll basically, prescribe, right, things that are not pharmaceuticals, but they're made in a pharmaceutical factory,
Right. Right.
right? And they're said, based on natural things or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But they could also include occasional pharmaceuticals, like we talked about ivermectin earlier, right? That can come out of this space as well. So this is essentially the same model that you're dependent on them for testing. You're dependent on them for the treatment. The treatment comes from a pill, not from your body doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of thing. And within that, they're still, believing in germ theory.
Right.
So, but instead of antibiotics, they're using, colloidal silver, or they're using, black seed oil, or, some other thing that supposedly has antibiotic or parasitic, helminthic properties. Also, inflammation, I think, is a big error that they, and I don't think these things really do this necessarily, but they're like, instead of, ibuprofen and steroids, they're like, well, take curcumin, which is, inflammation is a healing process. You don't want to block it or turn it off. That would be, against the interest of your body. But they still think that way and think inflammation is a bad thing, or a lot of times even it's claimed that inflammation is the cause, of a health problem, even though it's it's a normal biological process.
Right.
So those are some of the biggest errors, conceptual and practice-wise, that I think are pervasive in the alternative medicine. And a lot of people have good intentions. They may not know better, or like a lot of doctors, of physicians, right? That they made a transition, from doing the traditional allopathic medicine where they just prescribe pills all day, right, over to and I forget what the current buzzword they call it, but they've called it different things, but essentially it's some kind of alternative practice.
Functional medicine.
Functional medicine.
Yep.
But they end
Integrative
up
medicine.
doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Just instead of pharmaceuticals, like I said, supplements. But then when someone gets really sick, then they go right back to the mainstream. Like they send them to the oncologist or the cardiologist or whatever. Right. So that's not really that much of a different paradigm, but it is economically rewarding, because they're usually selling the things themselves instead of, writing an order for them to go to LabCorp, and LabCorp makes the money off the tests. They bought a machine and do the tests in their office.
Right. I appreciate that answer. I guess as we're closing up, is there anything you want to share with what you're working on with True Living Fellowship, or anything else you got going on at andrewkaufmanmd.com? I think that's the website. If not, I'll have it in the show notes.
That's okay. I have a couple of different websites.
Yeah, you have
anyway.
a few. I think that's why I get tripped up. I'm like, I think you have a few different websites. They all tie in together.
Yeah,
though, right?
If you go to andrewkaufmanmd.com, you'll be able to access everything that I offer. And, Alec, I mean, I'm kind of on a mission to, one, discover the truth about health and biology, and also to, teach that knowledge, and especially as it applies to healing, but even, in general, I want to help people learn how to uncover the truth, how to look at information themselves, make their own opinions. And I have selfish interests, in there too, because I want this to be a better place. I don't want to be subjugated by the elites forever and oppressed. So I do a lot of different things. I have my educational mission, and I am gauging up for a big workshop called the Minerals First Workshop, where I'm going to teach you about the importance of this, and when you're missing these minerals, how it affects your health and how you can easily overcome this. And that you also your body can't, remember, do healing without having the right raw materials. And that's a big part of the raw materials, but one that's often overlooked. I have a community called the True Living Fellowship, where we have all come together to try and learn how to live more truthfully and actually enact that. And part of that is learning about the truth, and then the next step is embodying it, integrating it into your day-to-day life. And we have amazing people in there that support each other. It's not just like I tell them how to live life. It's like they've come together because, you know, they want to do this independently, and they've already taken steps, most of them. And that's really enriching. And, you know, we have a lot of educational material that we give them, teaching them how to think, inspiring them to you know, consider certain things, consider doing things a different way. And then I also evaluate and sell just a couple of natural health products. And, you know, a big part of that is because there's so many things out there that people are selling or that are available that are not helpful. Some of them are even dangerous. And a lot of people that are selling them don't necessarily even know this. They are trying to do the right thing and do something good. But, you know, for me, like, I have a very high level of evidence required for me to be comfortable, you know, using something for healing purposes or for health maintenance. And I'm always going to experiment on myself first to, you know, see what the experience is and gauge, you know, is this a real thing or not? And so, you know, that if it's one of the few things I sell that there's a mountain of evidence backing it up, that certainly it is safe above all, and that it actually, you know, can be effective in helping the body heal in some way. So, you know, through those three avenues is really how I try to contribute to this overall, you know, paradigm shift towards a much better and more truthful version, you know, of natural healing.
Well, your contributions are greatly appreciated. I can say that thoroughly. And there's a whole separate podcast that we could record related to law, which we didn't even touch on. I mean, dude, there's like 30 more episodes we could record with you. You're such a wealth of knowledge, and you really do have a mountain of evidence behind the various, you know, positions that you hold and that you promote. And I think more important than that, though, you encourage people to do their own research and to look into it. And you don't claim to be some guru that's everyone should outsource to. It's quite the opposite. You really, really do encourage people to look into these things for themselves. And it's so refreshing, especially with someone with your credentials, having gone to MIT and things like this. Like, it could be very easy for someone to look at you and want to outsource, especially as the mainstream paradigm is crumbling and people who haven't resolved that consciousness are just looking for the next person that they can blindly follow. So it's really refreshing, and I really appreciate you, man.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for being with me today.
It's really been a pleasure, Alec.